The hiss of a pressure relief valve on a tank car that left the rails in East Palestine, Ohio, was the first warning. Not a whistle, not an explosion, just a thin, continuous breath of pressurized gas escaping into the February dark. 3 days later, that gas became a black mushroom cloud so thick it turned daylight into chemical dusk. Residents watched from their porches as the plume rose, and then they felt it. A sting in the eyes that wouldn't rinse away, a metallic taste like breathing pennies, a cough that started shallow and then dug deeper. They were breathing vinyl chloride monomer, the invisible ancestor of every PVC pipe, every vinyl window frame, every blood bag and credit card and piece of electrical insulation in their homes. The molecule that had been designed to be locked inside a solid, stable, fire-resistant plastic was now free, heavier than air, hugging the ground and following drainage ditches into basements and lungs. This is the paradox at the heart of modern chemistry. A substance can be perfectly safe in its finished form and lethally dangerous in its raw state. The pipe under your sink will not give you cancer. But the gas that made that pipe, the pressurized monomer that travels through your town on rail cars, has already killed men in Louisville, left its signature on the livers of factory workers, and seeded the soil of Ohio with dioxins that will outlast this generation. Welcome to the Deep Archive. We are leaving the surface now. The press conferences, the reassuring numbers, the phrase below levels of concern. The hatch seals shut. Pressure builds. The dark water closes around us. Below, in the sealed files and glass cases of this submerged room, the evidence waits. A firefighter's jacket in Ville Platte, Louisiana, that still smells of a 2011 tank car fire. The rat cages from Cesare Maltoni's laboratory in Bentivoglio, where thousands of animals breathed measured doses until their livers failed. A glass jar on a high school lab shelf in East Palestine, its contents slowly separating into a white film, labeled "Run this next year." And inside the cells of men who never knew they were writing a medical record, the DNA adducts, chloroethylene oxide bound to guanine, a miscoating that becomes a tumor decades later. The gas that burned over Ohio is vinyl chloride. Its story begins not in Ohio, but in a cold Paris laboratory in 1835, with a sweet-smelling liquid that a young chemist noted and then set aside. The archive is open. The real descent begins now. On the evening of February 3, 2023, a sound drifted across the eastern edge of East Palestine, Ohio, that some of the older residents mistook for a steam locomotive. It was not a whistle, not the rhythmic chug of pistons, but a thin, continuous hiss, high and urgent, like pressurized breath escaping a metal lung. That sound came from a pressure relief valve on a tank car that had left the rails, and it was the first warning that something normally kept sealed and invisible was now free and moving through the dark. The train was Norfolk Southern 32N, a 1.5 mile long chain of 149 cars, hauling freight from the industrial complexes of the Midwest toward the eastern seaboard. 38 of those cars would derail that night on a curve near the Pennsylvania border, piling into a twisted, smoking braid of steel and chemicals. Among the wreckage were 11 tank cars carrying vinyl chloride monomer, a pressurized gas that the world consumes by the millions of tons to manufacture polyvinyl chloride, PVC, the rigid white pipe, the flexible medical tubing, the vinyl siding, the children's toys, the credit cards, the raincoats, the window frames, the floor tiles, the electrical insulation that runs behind every wall of every modern American home. The material had been so thoroughly woven into the fabric of ordinary life that most people in East Palestine had never heard its chemical name, even though its finished form surrounded them in their kitchens, their bathrooms, their hospitals, their schools. The gas inside those tank cars was the invisible ancestor of their entire plastic environment, and it had arrived in their town not as a product, but as a problem. Vinyl chloride is a molecule of deceptive simplicity: 2 carbon atoms, 3 hydrogen atoms, 1 chlorine atom. At room temperature, it is a colorless gas with a faintly sweet, ether-like odor that many describe as resembling chloroform, but thinner, more elusive. To ship it efficiently, industry stores it as a refrigerated liquid under moderate pressure, at temperatures that keep it below its boiling point of -13 degrees Celsius, 8.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That number matters because it means that on a mild winter night in Ohio, a tank car full of liquid vinyl chloride is already holding back a substance desperate to become a vapor. When the insulating jacket of a derailed car is compromised and the refrigeration fails, the liquid begins to warm toward that threshold. At -13, it does not simmer or bubble. It erupts into an invisible, heavier-than-air gas that hugs the ground, rolls downhill, follows drainage ditches and creek beds, pools and basements, and seeps into the low places where air does not circulate. This is not a cloud that rises and disperses like steam from a cooling tower. This is a creeping fog that obeys gravity, a dense ghost that fills the topography the way water fills a basin, invisible and silent except for the hiss of the valve that betrayed its presence. In the first hours, the emergency response was a desperate accounting of unknowns. Firefighters arrived to find cars labeled with hazard placards, but no clear sense of what was burning, what was leaking, what was merely waiting. The temperature sensors inside the vinyl chloride cars began to show troubling readings. The chemistry that makes vinyl chloride manageable as a refrigerated liquid also makes it unstable when heated. As the temperature rises, the liquid expands, the pressure climbs, and the risk of a boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion, a believe, moves from a theoretical possibility toward a mechanical certainty. A believe is not a conventional fire. It is a catastrophic rupture of a pressurized vessel that launches shrapnel and releases a flash of vapor that ignites into a fireball, a shock wave, a sudden rearrangement of the local geography. The model suggested that if even one of the vinyl chloride cars failed, the shrapnel could travel a mile, puncturing other cars, cascading the disaster beyond any fire break. 3 days after the derailment, on February 6th, authorities made a decision. They would vent 5 of the vinyl chloride cars into trenches and set the gas alight in a controlled burn. The logic was straightforward, brutal, and borrowed from a long history of industrial accidents managed at the edge of capacity. Trade one kind of catastrophe for another. Convert the explosive potential of a pressurized tank into an atmospheric plume. Burn the monster in the open instead of letting it tear itself apart in the dark. Workers cut holes in the tank cars, drained the liquid vinyl chloride into excavated pits, ignited it, and watched. What rose was not the transparent shimmer of a clean flame. It was a towering black mushroom cloud, dense and opaque, roiling with hydrogen chloride, phosgene, and trace dioxins, a column of combustion products that turned the daylight into an overcast of chemical dusk visible for miles across the Ohio-Pennsylvania border. The cloud was so thick it appeared solid, a pleated curtain of soot and acid gases folding upward into the winter sky. Residents who had gathered on their porches to watch the orange glow on the horizon now saw something that did not dissipate but spread, a dark bloom that seemed to hang in the air like a bruise, slowly drifting over homes, over streams, over the bare February fields. The reports from that day carry a particular vocabulary that emergency responders learn, but civilians never expect to hear applied to their own air. Hydrogen chloride combines with moisture, the humidity of a winter afternoon, the wet tissue of a lung, to form hydrochloric acid. Phosgene, a compound infamous since the First World War for its delayed, suffocating effect on soldiers in trenches, forms when chlorinated hydrocarbons burn incompletely. Dioxins and furans are not acute poisons in the sense of immediate collapse. They are persistent, fat-seeking, slow accumulating molecules that the body stores and stores until, years later, the cellular machinery begins to misread its own instructions. The cloud that settled over East Palestine was not a single toxin, but a composite, a mixture whose full inventory would take months for laboratories to identify and years for epidemiologists to interpret. People who stood beneath it described the air as feeling like acid, not a smell, but a sensation, a sharpness at the back of the throat that turned to a metallic taste, a burn in the eyes that water could not rinse away, a cough that started shallow and then dug deeper. One resident said it felt like breathing pennies. Another said the air stung the way a chlorine swimming pool stings, but without the water to dilute it, and without the exit to the fresh air of a locker room. The strange part was not that the cloud existed. It was that the cloud was made of a substance that had been designed, from its first industrial use, to disappear. Vinyl chloride is the raw material for a finished product whose entire value proposition is inertness. The miracle of PVC is that you can forget it. It does not rust. It does not rot. It does not support flame. It does not leach anything that your municipal water report will flag with a red exceedance. The gas that is so reactive, so volatile, so carcinogenic in its monomeric form is locked inside a white solid as stable as bone, as silent as the plumbing beneath a suburban street. That transformation is the foundational achievement of the polymer chemist, the taming of a dangerous molecule into a domesticated object. We do not see vinyl chloride when we open a tap. We do not smell it in a new vinyl shower curtain. We do not taste it in the water that has traveled through PVC pipes from the treatment plant to the kitchen sink. The chemical has been tamed into transparency, sealed into the walls, the floors, the medical devices, the packaging. It is a gas that learned to be a solid, and in that solid state, it acquired the invisibility of the ordinary. It became, for all practical purposes, a secret. But on the night of February 3rd, and in the days that followed, the secret came out of hiding. The derailed tank cars were a breach, not just in the steel of a pressure vessel, but in the century-long bargain between chemistry and civilization. The gas that should have been locked inside a polymer matrix, a pipe, a toy, a blood bag, was now moving freely through the open air of a small town. It had been designed to be a building block, not a breathable atmosphere. It had been engineered for containment, not for combustion on a scale that would paint the sky black. The cloud over East Palestine was a visible monument to hidden risk, a reminder that the infrastructure of modern life is not a permanent settlement, but a temporary truce maintained by pressure gauges and safety valves, and the assumption that the rail car will not buckle on a curve. The hiss in the night was the sound of that truce being renegotiated without anyone's consent. And yet, the cloud itself was not the end. It was the beginning of a slower, more insidious form of exposure that would not be captured by the dramatic photographs or the news helicopters. The heavier-than-air vapor that had seeped from the damaged cars before the burn had already followed the drainage patterns, entering Sulphur Run and the surrounding soil, dissolving into the groundwater at concentrations that instruments could detect, but that no regulatory standard could easily adjudicate. The black plume from the controlled burn had lofted dioxins and particulates into the air, and these would settle over the following days and weeks onto gardens, onto windowsills, onto the coats of dogs who came inside and shook off the dust onto living room carpets. The visible disaster was the mushroom cloud, the spectacle, the thing that could be pointed at and denounced on social media. The invisible disaster was the deposition, the slow accumulation, the chemical that would show up later in well tests, in soil samples, in the fatty tissue of deer hunted in the surrounding woods. The cloud that should not have been there had done its work in a day. The consequences would take decades to unfold. That night, while the controlled burn was still sending its column into the winter sky, a family gathered on a porch a mile from the site and listened to the sound that had started it all. It was not the roar of the fire, which was distant and low. It was the hiss of a pressure relief valve, still cycling on a car that had not yet been breached, a rhythmic sigh that rose and fell like the breath of a sleeping animal. The children asked what the sound was. The parents said it was the train, still settling. It was easier to say that than to explain that the air itself was being reshaped by a molecule nobody in the neighborhood had ever learned to fear, because the fear had always been stored elsewhere, in the factory, in the rail yard, in the chemical plant, and had never before come home to a place where the only clouds that normally formed were made of water. The hiss continued into the early morning hours, a sound like a distant steam locomotive in a town where steam locomotives had not run for 70 years. A ghost of the industrial age arriving on the porch of the post-industrial present, carrying with it the unbilled cost of everything plastic that had ever made life more convenient. The laboratory on the Rue de l'Estrapade was cold that January morning in 1835, the kind of damp Parisian cold that seeped through wool coats and condensed on the inner walls of glass retorts. Henry Victor Regnault, 25 years old and already gifted with hands that seemed to know what the brain had not yet formulated, was passing a stream of hydrogen chloride gas through a flask of acetylene that had been prepared from calcium carbide and water. The glassware was arranged in the standard ladder of the time, a generating vessel, a drying tube packed with calcium chloride, a receiving flask cooled in a basin of snow brought down from the attic by a laboratory assistant whose name the notebooks do not record. Regnault noted the temperature of the cooling bath, adjusted the flow of gas with a pinch clamp on a rubber tube, and watched. What collected in the receiving flask was not the familiar waxy residue of earlier acetylene experiments. It was a liquid, clear as gin, that separated into a distinct layer and refused to mix with the water that had condensed alongside it. He decanted it carefully, held the flask to the window light, and wrote in his laboratory journal, "Un liqueur éthéré particulier," a peculiar ethereal liquid. He noted the Swedish odor, something like chloroform but thinner, with a faint back of the throat sharpness that lingered longer than it should. When he stoppered the flask and set it aside, he had no way of knowing that the two-carbon skeleton he had just tethered to a chlorine atom would outlive every empire then standing on the European continent. The compound remained a chemical oddity for nearly 4 decades. It acquired a name, vinyl chloride, after the hypothetical vinyl radical that chemists were beginning to imagine, and a formula that found its way into the indexes of organic chemistry textbooks as a footnote, a demonstration of what happened when acetylene met hydrogen halides. A few researchers reproduced Regnault's synthesis, confirmed the boiling point, remarked on the volatility, and moved on. The liquid had no obvious use. It was too flammable to store in quantity, too unstable to transport, too reactive to serve as a solvent. In the glass-fronted cabinets of Continental laboratories, samples of vinyl chloride sat in sealed ampoules, their existence recorded in the tight copperplate of inventory ledgers, their potential entirely invisible because the very concept of a synthetic polymer had not yet been invented. The gas was a ghost, without a body, a molecule looking for a crime. The strange part was not that it existed, but that it kept insisting on becoming something else. Chemists who stored it noticed that over time, even in the dark, a faint white film appeared on the inside of the glass, a solid that could be scraped off with a spatula, inert and powdery with no immediately obvious structure. Most dismissed it as an impurity, a decomposition product of no interest. In 1872, a German chemist named Eugen Baumann decided to stop dismissing it. Baumann was not a theorist. He was a patient observer of small transformations, the kind of researcher who could sit for hours watching a sealed tube on a windowsill. He filled several thick-walled glass tubes with vinyl chloride, sealed them in a flame, and placed them where the sun would find them on a laboratory sill in the Physiological Institute at the University of Freiburg. For weeks, nothing. Then a slight cloudiness, a fine white precipitate that gathered at the bottom of the tubes and refused to redissolve when the tubes were shaken. Baumann broke the seals, decanted the remaining liquid, and dried the white residue. Under a hand lens, it was a powder. Under a solvent, it was stubbornly insoluble. He had made, without intending to, the first specimen of polyvinyl chloride, the first vinyl plastic, born from sunlight and patience on a German windowsill, delivered into a world that had no name for it and no use. The record shows a discovery. The margin shows indifference. Baumann published his observation in a German chemical journal, noting that vinyl chloride, verwandelt sich im Sonnenlicht in einen weißen, festen Körper, transforms itself in sunlight into a white, solid body. A few colleagues read the paper. A few more replicated the result. And then the white powder joined its parent liquid in the quiet limbo of laboratory curiosities, filed between the synthesis of aniline dyes and the isolation of alkaloids, waiting for an industrial logic that had not yet been invented. The paradox was already forming, though nobody could see it. The molecule that would one day become the third most produced plastic in the world, sheathing the wires of cities, carrying the drinking water of suburbs, holding the blood of the wounded, began as an unwanted residue. A chemical oddity that kept trying to turn itself into something solid in the dark and kept being thrown away. The laboratory notebooks of the period convey the compound's orphan status in the very handwriting that records it. A single page from a French industrial chemistry ledger, dated 1888, lists vinyl chloride among produits sans débouché commercial, products with no commercial outlet. The ink is fading now, bleeding slightly at the edges where humidity touched the paper over the intervening century, but the words are still legible. Odeur rappelant le chloroforme, mais plus douce, et une vapeur qui pique les yeux des heures plus tard, an odor like chloroform, but sweeter, and a vapor that stings the eyes hours later. The chemist who wrote those words had obviously held a flask of the liquid too close to his face, drawn a breath of the invisible vapor, and noted the delayed irritation as a warning for whoever might handle the compound next. He was writing a safety note before safety notes had a formal vocabulary, encoding in the margin of an inventory the first recorded symptom of what would later be called, in a different language and a different century, a workplace exposure. By the turn of the 20th century, vinyl chloride had acquired a reputation. It was not a reputation for danger in the modern sense. Nobody yet understood carcinogenesis, and the liver tumors of the future were still invisible, decades away from their first victims. The reputation was practical, born in the acetylene-lit chambers of early industrial chemistry. The stuff was troublesome. It boiled at minus 13 degrees Celsius, which meant it had to be stored under pressure or under refrigeration, and any leak turned instantly into a creeping gas that hugged the floor and followed drains and seams. It was shockingly flammable, capable of forming explosive mixtures with air at concentrations as low as 4%. Chemists who handled far deadlier substances, arsine gas, hydrogen cyanide, chlorine itself, still treated vinyl chloride with a particular wariness because it combined volatility with an apparent innocence. It had a faintly pleasant smell, like chloroform sweetened with something forgotten, and it gave no immediate warning of its presence beyond that sweetness. The gas was invisible, heavier than air, and it waited. An open flame a meter away could turn a quiet laboratory into a flash of pale green fire moving along the floor like an ignited spirit. The notebooks of the German chemical cartels contain incident reports written in the clipped, bureaucratic language of accident investigation. Ein Arbeiter bemerkte Geruch, Dan Zündung. A worker noticed an odor, then ignition. The transition from laboratory ghost to industrial commodity did not happen in a single moment of discovery. It happened in the slow, hesitant way that most dangerous things become useful, through a series of small accommodations, each one justified by a pressing need. The intermediate years saw vinyl chloride used as a chemical intermediate in the production of ethylene dichloride and other solvents, a role that kept it contained within the closed systems of chemical plants. Its volatility was a nuisance that could be managed with pressure vessels and flanges. Its flammability was a known risk, printed on handling sheets that nobody outside the factory gates ever read. The United States Chemical Safety Board would later document, from fragmentary records, that at least 14 serious fires involving vinyl chloride occurred in American plants between 1910 and 1940. Many of them attributed to spontaneous decomposition or pressure release events, phrases that sanitized the sudden roar of gas igniting against a distillation column and the long silence that followed. The body count from those fires was never systematically tallied. The men who worked in the early vinyl chloride plants were not the subjects of epidemiological studies. They were names on payroll ledgers that were eventually discarded, or on death certificates that listed causes like burns or inhalation of fumes without the chemical genealogy that would have made the pattern visible. What makes this prehistory unsettling when examined through the lens of what happened later is not that anyone was hiding a known catastrophe. Nothing was known. The carcinogenicity of vinyl chloride was not a secret kept in a locked drawer. It was a future that had not arrived, a set of cellular mechanisms that would take another 70 years to leave their signatures in the angiosarcoma cells of men not yet born. The unease comes from a different source, the recognition that a substance can move through the world for a century without ever being questioned, its risks unmeasured, its toxicology unimagined, because the economy had not yet found a reason to produce it in vast quantities. The danger was not hidden in the poison. It was hidden in the dosage, or rather, hidden in the future scale of production that no 19th century chemist could have foreseen. The sealed tubes in Bauman's sunlight were the first small warning, if anyone had known how to read them. Sunlight had provided the energy to break the carbon-chlorine bonds just enough to let the vinyl chloride molecules link together in long chains, shedding their volatility and becoming a stable white solid. In that accidental polymerization lay the entire logic of the PVC industry that would rise half a century later, take a toxic, flammable, volatile gas, use heat, pressure, and catalysts to stitch its molecules into an inert, durable, fire-resistant polymer and call the result safe. Because the danger was locked inside. But the lock was never perfect. Every polymerization process leaves unreacted monomer, a percentage, a residual, a ghost of the starting material trapped inside the finished product. That residual would later be measured in parts per million and parts per billion, regulated into existence, argued over in courtrooms and agency hearings. But in 1872, it was simply the white film on the inside of a glass tube, a curiosity that Bauman scraped into a sample vial and labeled with the date and his initials, as if the molecule itself were signing for a delivery that would not arrive for another generation. The archive of early vinyl chloride research smells of dust and old paper. But if you could walk through the stacks of the chemical libraries where those journals are kept, the yellowed issues of the Annalen der Chemie, the hand-bound volumes of the Comte des Rendus, you might notice a pattern that is not visible in any single document. The compound keeps appearing in the margins, a footnote on acetylene chemistry, a paragraph in a review article, a patent application that mentions it in passing, a safety bulletin from a German Chemical Workers Insurance Association that notes, in 1923, that repeated inhalation of vinyl chloride vapors has been observed to cause dizziness and headache in factory workers, though no permanent injury has been established. The word established is doing a lot of work in that sentence. It means that nobody had looked long enough, or with the right instruments, or with a hypothesis that connected a solvent-like smell to a liver cell's DNA 30 years down the line. The body keeps its own books, but the ledger was written in a language that medicine had not yet learned to read. And so the gas sat in its steel cylinders and glass ampoules waiting for the plastic age to give it a purpose, waiting for the war that would make rubber scarce and synthetic substitutes urgently necessary, waiting for the polymer chemists who would learn to tame its volatility with plasticizers and stabilizers, turning the brittle white powder into a material that could be shaped into pipes, raincoats, electrical insulation, blood bags, children's toys, and the siding of millions of homes. The sweet odor that stung the eyes hours later would become the faint plastic smell of a new shower curtain, the taste of water. From a garden hose, the background scent of a freshly constructed suburban subdivision, so faint that nobody would connect it to the laboratory notebook in Paris, or the windowsill in Freiburg, or the workers who felt dizzy near the flanges and went home to sleep it off, not knowing that the sleep was the body's way of coping with a molecule it could not metabolize without self-injury. The bottle was small enough to disappear in a coat pocket, but large enough to change a border. Regnolt's original sample, if it survived at all, is lost now, evaporated, oxidized, or washed down a Paris drain sometime in the 19th century, while its creator moved on to other researches, other gases, other liquids that would be named and cataloged without ever escaping the index. But the molecule itself never left. It multiplied. It seeded itself into the supply chains that would carry it from the Gulf Coast chemical complexes to the polymerization plants of the Ohio Valley, and from there into the walls and floors and plumbing of the American century. Every length of PVC pipe, every vinyl window frame, every credit card and IV bag, and children's wading pool contained, in its final molecular architecture, a memory of that first sweet vapor rising from a flask in the Rue de l'Estrapade, a ghost preserved in plastic, benign until the day the plastic burned or leached or simply aged enough to release what it had been holding all along. The discovery did not end the story. It made the story portable. And the compound that no one wanted, the residue that kept turning into a solid in the dark, traveled forward into a world that would embrace it so completely that its origin in accident and indifference would be forgotten until the night the rails broke in Ohio and the ghost came home. In the winter of 1926, a man in a third-floor laboratory in Akron, Ohio, stood over a steam-heated roller mill and watched a material fail for the 100th time. The room smelled of hot rubber, of sulfur and carbon black, of the heavy perfume of an industry still learning what it could get away with. The man's name was Waldo Semin, and he was employed by B.F. Goodrich to find something, anything, that would stretch where rubber was growing scarce. The problem on his bench was polyvinyl chloride, a white powder known mostly as a chemical dead end, a brittle resin that decomposed before it melted and left a corrosive stink that etched the inside of the equipment and the patience of everyone who tried to mold it. The powder looked inert, almost innocent, the color of ground bone, but when the rollers heated it to working temperature, the material blackened, spat hydrogen chloride gas, and crumbled into a useless char that had to be scraped off the steel with a knife. Semin had tried solvents and fillers, and blends with natural rubber, and every attempt ended the same way, with a handful of sour grit and a headache that lasted into the evening. That afternoon, or perhaps the next, the records are a little soft on the hour, he took a batch of the powder and mixed it with a high-boiling liquid called tricresyl phosphate, a syrupy ester that smelled faintly of coal tar and medicine. He folded the liquid into the white resin until the mass became a stiff, translucent dough, then fed it through the heated rollers one more time, expecting the familiar acrid puff and the charred crust. Instead, the material softened and fused into a continuous sheet, smooth as oilcloth, flexible as leather, and when he pulled it from the mill, it stretched without tearing and rebounded with an elastic memory that no one in that building had ever seen from an all-synthetic substance. The gas that had always announced its escape, the hydrogen chloride that curled from degrading PVC like a chemical complaint, stayed sealed inside the new matrix, locked within the long chains of the polymer and the interposed molecules of the phosphate ester. Semin had not eliminated the instability. He had given it a chaperone, a molecular chaperone that kept the corrosive temper of the chlorine atoms pacified in a gel state so long as the heat remained below the point of rupture. He had turned a liability into a leash. The chemistry is worth a slow look, because it explains a great deal of what came later. Polyvinyl chloride is a chain of carbon atoms strung 2 by 2, each alternating carbon bearing a hydrogen and a chlorine. Chlorine, at 57% of the polymer's weight, is the heavy element here, the gift of common salt split by electrolysis, and it is the chlorine that makes the material both stubborn and, in another context, fireproof. In the raw powder, the chains are packed tightly, and the chlorine atoms, large and electronegative, attract one another across the chains like tiny grappling hooks. locking the structure into a rigid, glassy state that shatters when struck. To make it flow, you must heat it past its degradation point, around 160 degrees Celsius, at which the chlorine begins to peel off as hydrogen chloride, and the chain backbone begins to blacken and cross-link into useless char. Plasticizers work by inserting themselves between the chains, pushing the chlorine hooks apart and lubricating the polymer into a flexible, rubbery substance at temperatures far below decomposition. The liquid acts as a permanent internal solvent, a silent mediator that does not evaporate but stays for decades, keeping the chains from locking back into their brittle arrangement. In return, the plastic asks for very little, except that you never let a flame get too close to the finished product. Because if the plasticizer burns away, the chlorine will come roaring back as hydrochloric acid, dense and white and hungry for moisture, for lung tissue, for steel. The Akron mill workers noticed the side effects first. Within a year of Semen's discovery, Goodrich had enough confidence in the new material, branded Chloroseal, to run it through the same 3-roll calendars that processed crude rubber. And the men on the floor began to notice a particular sensation at the back of the throat after 8 hours in the heat. It was not the familiar sulfur bite of vulcanization, nor the oily nausea that came from milling reclaimed rubber. This was newer, sharper, like the smell of a swimming pool but drier, a faint bleach-like tingle that clung to the soft palate and made the saliva taste faintly metallic by the end of the shift. The company doctors, when they were asked, attributed it to fumes and suggested better ventilation, which the engineers provided in the form of overhead fans that dispersed the vapor without measuring it. No one at the time knew that the tingle was the signature of hydrogen chloride gas at parts per million concentrations, an invisible exhalation from the material as it passed through the heated rolls. The plasticized PVC was stable enough to sell, stable enough to extrude into garden hose and raincoat fabric and wire insulation, but it was never truly inert. It breathed its acid ghost whenever the machinery pushed past 150 degrees Celsius, a quiet reminder that the chlorine had not been removed, only persuaded to wait. What persuaded the world to accept this compromise was a global catastrophe. By 1941, Japanese forces had overrun the rubber plantations of Southeast Asia, cutting off more than 90% of the natural latex supply to the Allied nations. Rubber became an existential military priority. Without it, there could be no tires for bombers, no insulation for the millions of miles of communication wire, no seals for fuel tanks, no flexible coatings for the hulls of ships that needed to evade magnetic mines. The search for synthetic substitutes turned every laboratory into a war room, and PVC, which had been a promising but commercially modest material through the Depression, became a strategic asset almost overnight. The Navy needed wire that would not burn when a shell hit the conduit, and the chlorine in PVC gave it a fire resistance that polyethylene and natural rubber simply could not match. The same chlorine that made it difficult to process now prevented the spread of flame along a cable jacket, buying minutes inside a damaged destroyer. The Army Chemical Corps needed gas mask components that would remain flexible in a winter trench and impermeable to blister agents, and Siemens plasticized PVC, when calendared into thin sheets and sealed, provided a barrier that mustard gas could not penetrate. The same material that had blistered the throats of Akron mill hands was now being fabricated into hoods and diaphragms to protect soldiers from the very class of chemicals to which its own monomer belonged. This is the paradox at the center of the story, and it will follow the molecule into every decade that succeeds. Polyvinyl chloride became the infrastructure of safety by domesticating a poison that never fully went away. The chlorine that made PVC intrinsically fire-resistant also meant that when the fire grew large enough to overwhelm the plasticizer and break the carbon-chlorine bonds, the smoke would carry hydrochloric acid, carbon monoxide, and, if the temperature climbed past 600 degrees Celsius, trace dioxins and furans that lodged in fatty tissue and stay for a generation. The durability that made PVC pipe a century-long alternative to corroding iron also meant that the pipe, at the end of its service life, could not be incinerated without elaborate scrubbing and could not be buried without leaching phthalate plasticizers and residual monomer into the groundwater. The flexibility that allowed a PVC blood bag to save a wounded soldier in a field hospital came from the same class of ester compounds that, decades later, endocrine researchers would find migrating into the stored plasma, and then into the veins of the patient, and then into the epidemiological record as a possible contributor to a quiet shift in human development that no one had been looking for when the blood bag was designed. The war made all of this secondary. Between 1942 and 1945, American PVC production more than quadrupled, and the manufacturing hubs that grew around the new plants, in Louisville, in Pasadena, in Niagara Falls, became the proving grounds for a technology that no longer belonged to a single company or a single patent. The polymer chemists who had once puzzled over the brittle white powder in university laboratories now wore military uniforms and carried security clearances, and their notebooks were classified documents locked in steel cabinets. The monomer, vinyl chloride, traveled the country in pressurized tank cars with stenciled warnings that acknowledged its flammability and its tendency to form explosive mixtures with air, but said nothing about the long-term habit of the gas to accumulate in the body and weight. The immediate danger of fire was, after all, the only danger that the insurance underwriters and the War Production Board needed to weigh. The chronic danger, the one that would not manifest until the workers who unloaded the tank cars had been breathing the vapor for 2 decades, was still a conjecture, a footnote in a European toxicology journal that no one in a position of authority had translated or acted upon. One of those chemical journals from a German laboratory in 1930 had noted in passing that autoclave workers exposed repeatedly to vinyl chloride vapor developed a peculiar set of symptoms: a numbness in the fingers, a Raynaud-like blanching, a dull ache in the bones of the forearm that seemed to improve when the men were reassigned to other parts of the plant. The observation was published without follow-up, filed under industrial hygiene curiosities, and forgotten by the time B.F. Goodrich began producing PVC at scale. The American factory floors of the mid-1940s, running 3 shifts to meet the war demand, were filled with a younger workforce that had no expectation of occupational disease beyond the known hazards of burns, falls, and acute chemical pneumonitis. The faint bleach tingle at the back of the throat was not a warning. It was simply the smell of the job, like the machine oil on a machinist's overalls or the creosote on a railroad man's hands. It was the odor of employment, and employment in those years was a mercy that no one wanted to examine too closely. The transition from war production to civilian markets after 1945 carried the chlorine molecule into every corner of the domestic landscape with a speed that still seems, in retrospect, slightly dreamlike. The same factories that had insulated fleet communication cables, retooled to extrude thin-walled pipe for residential plumbing, replacing the copper and galvanized steel that were suddenly scarce and expensive in a housing boom that had no patience for traditional materials. PVC siding appeared on suburban tract homes, its chemical inertness marketed as permanence, its chlorine content a silent guarantee that the house would not burn as quickly as a wooden one. The raincoat that had kept a signal corpsman dry in the monsoon became a child's slicker in a hall closet in Levittown, still carrying the faint solvent note of the plasticizer, still capable of stiffening and cracking after years of exposure to sunlight, but cheap enough to replace without grief. The material that had been born as an accident in a sunlit flask in 1872, and then tamed into a gel by a patient man in Akron in 1926, had become so utterly normal that no one picking up a vinyl record or stepping onto a vinyl floor in 1965 would have thought to connect that glossy surface with the corrosive gas that had once made a laboratory chemist blink and step back from the bench. But the gas was there, held in a state of suspension, sealed into the plastic's architecture by the thermal discipline of the factory and the chemical chaperone of the plasticizer. The seal was a social contract as much as a molecular one. It required the assumption that manufacturers would keep the monomer contained inside the reaction vessels, that pipelines would not leak, that rail cars would stay on their rails, that fires would remain small and extinguishable, and that the eventual disposal of the material, by landfill, by incineration, by simple neglect, would distribute whatever residual toxicity remained so thinly across time and geography that it would never add up to a single body in a single clinic for a single doctor to connect to a single cause. That assumption held for decades, more or less. While the global production of PVC climbed past 20 million tons annually, while the pipes buried under the streets of every major city in the developed world carried drinking water through the corpse of a gas that had been made safe by being made solid, and while the memory of what the material had smelled like when it first came off the mill, the bleach tingle, the metallic taste, receded into the background hum of industrial civilization. The trouble, as the archive will eventually record, is that a seal is only ever a delay. The chlorine inside the polymer does not forget its old habit of departing as an acid when the heat returns. The plasticizer that keeps the chains flexible will, given enough decades, slowly migrate to the surface as a greasy film, leaving the pipe brittle and the wire insulation cracked. The pressure vessel on a railcar, rolling through an Ohio winter at 45 miles per hour, does not care what century it is or how far the nation has come since the rubber shortage of 1942. It contains the same monomer that Henri Victor Regnault noted as a peculiar ethereal liquid in 1835, now compressed to a density that makes it a dormant detonation, a small concrete block plant in the countryside, a school bus route that crosses the tracks, a volunteer fire department that does not yet know the name of the chemical that will one day lift a black mushroom cloud over its jurisdiction. The miracle that Waldo Simon gave the world was real. It saved lives. It won wars. It plumbed clean water to places where contaminated wells had killed children for centuries. But the miracle came with a condition written in the fine print of its chemistry, a condition that the 1920s safety data sheet could not have listed, because the language for it did not yet exist. The material remembers the gas, and the gas remembers how to burn. By the end of the 1960s, the United States was piping its own future through walls at a rate no previous civilization had ever attempted. The numbers told the story in a language of sheer mass. 2.5 million tons of vinyl chloride produced annually, converted into polyvinyl chloride, that left factories as rigid white lengths of pipe, as pale gray siding panels, as clear tubing coiled on spools the size of truck tires. A plumber in a new suburban development outside Columbus could open a box of PVC pipe, cut it with an ordinary handsaw, and join the pieces with a solvent cement that smelled briefly of model airplane glue, and then set into a permanent weld. The copper that had once carried water through American houses was expensive, heavy, and prone to pinhole corrosion in acidic soil. Iron rusted. Lead, by then, was beginning its long exit from the acceptable materials list. PVC arrived as the solution that cost less, weighed less, and promised to outlast the mortgage on the house itself. The promise was not false. PVC pipe, properly buried, could endure decades without degradation. It did not conduct electricity, so it needed no grounding. It resisted the mild acids and alkalis found in municipal water supplies. It did not support bacterial growth the way some older materials did. By 1970, millions of American homes drew their drinking water through PVC service lines, and the material had already begun its migration into hospitals, where flexible PVC blood bags and intravenous tubing were replacing glass bottles and rubber hoses. The same polymer that carried cold water to a kitchen sink in Toledo could carry type O negative blood into the arm of a woman in labor in Louisville. The infrastructure of modern safety was, increasingly, plastic. The strange part was not that it worked. The strange part was what it required in order to be made. Vinyl chloride monomer, the raw material of this revolution, is a colorless gas at ordinary room temperature. It has a faint, sweetish odor that some early industrial hygienists described as ethereal, a word that sounds pleasant until you learn it was the same word 19th century chemists used for chloroform and ether before they understood the neurological damage those anesthetics could cause. To turn this gas into a solid pipe, you must first compress and cool it until it liquefies, storing it in pressurized tanks at temperatures well below freezing. The polymerization reactor is a sealed vessel where the liquid monomer, suspended in water and stirred with chemical initiators, gradually links its small molecules into the long chains of polyvinyl chloride. The reaction generates heat. The vessel must be cooled continuously. Valves must open and close. Pumps must maintain pressure. And at every joint, every seal, every gasket that ages and stiffens with time, the colorless gas waits for a path outward. A closed system in a 1960s vinyl chloride plant was an aspiration, not a reality. The reactors were cleaned between batches. Operators opened manways and scraped polymer residue from interior walls while residual monomer vapor drifted into the breathing zone. Leaks from pump seals were common enough that maintenance crews carried portable explosimeters to check whether the air in a given corner of the plant was approaching the lower flammable limit. The gas was heavier than air, which meant it pooled in low places, drains, sumps, the bottom of stairwells, and lingered there until ventilation moved it elsewhere. Workers learned to recognize the sweet smell, and then they learned not to trust it, because after a few minutes of exposure, the olfactory nerves tired and the odor disappeared even when the concentration remained dangerously high. The paradox sat in the pipes themselves. A homeowner who installed PVC plumbing was bringing into the house one of the most inert, stable, non-toxic materials available. The same homeowner would have required a supplied air respirator to stand inside the reactor building where that pipe was born. The product was benign. The process was not, and the distance between the two was measured only by the thickness of a reactor wall and the diligence of a shift supervisor who might or might not have been told that the sweet-smelling gas was anything more than a nuisance. In 1971, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency made a quiet administrative move. Under the authority of the Clean Air Act, the agency listed vinyl chloride as a hazardous air pollutant. The listing was one of dozens issued that year, part of the early architecture of federal environmental regulation, and it attracted almost no public attention. The EPA's own documentation classified the compound as a toxic substance, acknowledging its flammability and its capacity to cause dizziness, headache, and disorientation at high concentrations. But the agency had no authority to set a workplace exposure limit. That power belonged to the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which had only come into existence the previous year and was still building its regulatory apparatus. And in 1971, no one in the federal government had yet proposed that vinyl chloride caused cancer. The word carcinogen does not appear in the early regulatory history of this molecule. The studies that would prove its potency were underway in Europe. Cesare Maltoni's rats were already breathing measured doses in Bentivoglio, Italy, but the results would not reach the English-language scientific literature for another 2 years. What American plant managers knew in 1971 was what the industry's own toxicological data sheets told them: that vinyl chloride could cause narcosis at high levels, that it was a fire and explosion hazard, and that workers sometimes complained of a condition called vinyl chloride illness, a collection of symptoms that included cold hands, numbness in the fingers, and a peculiar thickening of the skin on the palms. The condition was considered occupational, annoying, and fundamentally benign. The word angiosarcoma had not yet entered the vocabulary of the PVC industry. Consider for a moment the geography of this ignorance. The vinyl chloride plants of the late 1960s and early 1970s were concentrated in a handful of locations: Louisville, Kentucky; Lake Charles, Louisiana; Freeport, Texas; Pedricktown, New Jersey. In each of these places, men worked 8-hour shifts, sometimes 12, in atmospheres that no federal standard yet governed with any specificity. The American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, a private organization whose recommendations often preceded federal regulation, had suggested a threshold limit value of 500 parts per million for vinyl chloride, 500 parts per million. In a room where the gas concentration reached that level, a worker would smell the sweetness for a minute or two and then stop noticing it entirely. The liver, meanwhile, would keep noticing. The cytochrome P450 enzymes would keep metabolizing the gas into chloroethylene oxide, and the epoxide would keep binding to DNA, and the miscoating would accumulate in the hepatocytes, one shift after another, year after year, in a silence that no safety manager's explosimeter could measure. The baby born in a suburban hospital in 1973 would never know any of this. She would know only the warm weight of the plastic blood bag that the nurse lifted from a warming cabinet. Its contents matched to her mother's type and cross-matched against incompatibility. The bag was an engineering triumph. It was sterile, flexible, and transparent enough that the nurse could see the red cells settling and could squeeze the bag gently to mix them before the transfusion began. The tubing that ran from the bag to the needle in the infant's scalp vein was also PVC, softened with phthalate plasticizers that made it pliable enough not to damage delicate tissue. The entire apparatus was disposable, a single-use system that eliminated the risk of contamination from reused glass bottles and rubber tubing. It was, in every functional sense, a life-saving device manufactured by an industry that had mastered the art of taming a dangerous gas into a safe solid. The plant where that blood bag was made sat on the Ohio River in Louisville. 3 months before the transfusion, a polymer chemist on the morning shift had checked the batch records for the resin lot that would become the bag. The records showed acceptable levels of residual monomer, well within the company's internal specification. The chemist did not wear a respirator during his walk through the finishing building because the building was ventilated and because nobody had told him that the specification itself was based on manufacturing convenience rather than toxicology. The air in the finishing building tasted, he once told his wife, like machine oil and something sweet that gets caught in the back of your throat. He did not say this with alarm. He said it the way a mechanic might describe the smell of a garage, present, unremarkable, part of the job. The infant received the transfusion without complication. Her mother kept the hospital bracelet in a small box of keepsakes, a lock of hair, a birth announcement, a photograph of a wrinkled face that would smooth into childhood over the following months. The bracelet did not record the lot number of the blood bag. No registry tracked the children who received PVC blood products in 1973. The epidemiological trail that would later connect vinyl chloride to liver cancer would have no way of following this particular child, or the thousands like her, into their adult lives to measure whether the trace monomer that leached from the plastic during that first hour of life contributed anything at all to the long arithmetic of cellular damage. The question was not answerable with the tools available. It was answerable only in the aggregate, in the population studies that would emerge decades later and would show elevated cancer risks among communities living near PVC plants, among workers exposed to vinyl chloride, among the men who had stood closest to the reactor vessels and inhaled the gas that was supposed to stay inside the pipes. What was known in 1971 was enough to give a cautious observer pause, but not enough to change the economics of a material that was already embedded in the national infrastructure. The EPA listing of vinyl chloride as a hazardous pollutant was a bureaucratic flag planted on a map that had no roads. There was no enforcement mechanism for ambient air near plants. There was no workplace standard with the force of law. There was no requirement to monitor the health of the men who spent their careers in the polymerization buildings. The listing was a warning written in a language the country had not yet learned to read. The pipes, meanwhile, kept being laid. The houses kept being plumbed. The blood bags kept being manufactured and shipped and hung on IV poles in delivery rooms from Seattle to Miami. The infrastructure of modern American safety was expanding at the speed of economic logic, and the gas at its center remained, in the official understanding, a nuisance, a minor occupational irritant, a sweet smell in the stairwell, a footnote in the chemical manuals that had not yet been revised. The liver does not register nuisances. It registers molecules, and it was already, cell by cell, beginning to keep its own record. The operating room at Baptist Hospital still smelled of the morning's first procedures, a mix of isopropyl alcohol, damp linen, and the electric warmth of overhead lamps. The steel pan on the instrument table held a single surgical glove, palm turned outward, fingers curled slightly as if still remembering the shape of the hand that had worn it. A nurse would soon count the sponges, log the disposables, and send the pan to sterilization. But for a few minutes, the room was quiet, and the glove gave off a faint, sweetish odor, something like chloroform but milder, with a sharp back note that lingered at the bridge of the nose. It was the smell of vinyl chloride monomer, a trace of the chemical that had been used to manufacture the polyvinyl chloride blood bag hanging from a stand near the patient's head. No operating room ventilation system in 1973 could entirely scrub that odor from the air, nor from the bloodstream of the man on the table. The surgeon who had just closed the incision was Dr. John Creech, a careful man with a methodical habit of reviewing patient histories beyond the immediate surgical need. In January 1974, he found himself staring at a pathology report for a liver tumor that had metastasized in patterns he had rarely seen. The diagnosis was angiosarcoma of the liver, a malignancy that arises from the endothelial cells lining blood vessels, so uncommon that most medical textbooks devoted half a page to it. In the general population, it appears in roughly 1 person in 30 million. Yet within the span of a few months, Creech had encountered 4 cases. All 4 patients were men. All 4 worked at the B.F. Goodrich vinyl chloride polymerization plant in Louisville, just across the Ohio River. The plant had been producing PVC since the 1940s, and the men who operated the reactors worked in an atmosphere that was, by the standards of the time, considered unremarkable. When pressure gauges needed checking, when reactor vessels had to be opened for cleaning, when hoses leaked at couplings, vinyl chloride gas escaped. It was invisible, heavier than air, and it pooled in the lower levels of the production floor. Workers described the smell as a cross between cleaning fluid and something sweet, a note they learned to ignore. In the break rooms, on the bus home, the odor clung to coveralls and hair, a daily signature of employment that no one read as a warning. The gas had been classified as a nuisance vapor, an annoyance rather than a chronic threat. The company's safety data sheets noted its flammability, its tendency to cause dizziness at high concentrations, but nothing about the slow, silent accounting taking place inside the livers of the men who breathed it. Creech's 4 cases were not an immediate public alarm. They began as a medical curiosity, the kind of observation a surgeon shares with colleagues over coffee. But he was not content to let the pattern pass uninvestigated. He contacted the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, a young federal agency that had been given the mandate to investigate workplace hazards, but limited authority to enforce change. NIOSH sent epidemiologists to Louisville, and what they uncovered turned a curiosity into an indictment. They combed through employment records, death certificates, and union rolls. They mapped the workstations of every man who had ever been assigned to the polymerization vessels, the stripping columns, the bagging lines. When the numbers were tallied, the relative risk of angiosarcoma among vinyl chloride-exposed workers was up to 400 times higher than that of the general population. 400. The figure was so extreme that it rewrote the epidemiological rulebook. In the field of occupational cancer, a relative risk above 10 was considered significant. 400 meant the signal was not subtle. It was a scream. The liver had been accumulating damage for years, but the mechanism was only beginning to be understood. Once inhaled, vinyl chloride passes through the lungs into the bloodstream and travels to the liver, where the body attempts to metabolize it. The cytochrome P450 enzymes, which evolved over millions of years to break down plant toxins and foreign chemicals, transform vinyl chloride into chloroethylene oxide, a highly reactive epoxide. That molecule is an alkylating agent. It binds to DNA, forming adducts that scramble the genetic instructions during cell division. The liver's endothelial cells, which line the blood-filled sinusoids, are particularly vulnerable. Over decades of low-level exposure, the misread code accumulates, and a cancer that nature had made exceedingly rare becomes a company's signature pathology. The discovery did not stay in Louisville. As soon as NIOSH confirmed the cluster, the news traveled through the international medical community with the speed of a freight train on a downgrade. In Italy, Dr. Cesare Maltoni had been conducting the most exhaustive animal inhalation study ever attempted. His laboratory in Bentivoglio, outside Bologna, housed thousands of rats exposed to vinyl chloride at varying concentrations, some as low as 50 parts per million. Maltoni had already published preliminary results showing tumors forming in the livers, lungs, kidneys, and blood vessels of the animals. He had presented his data at conferences, had submitted papers to journals, had urged regulators to take note. The industry's response had been a polite form of silence. The U.S. plastics manufacturers had argued that rat studies did not necessarily predict human outcomes, that the doses were higher than workplace levels, that more research was needed before any action. The 4 men in Louisville ended that argument. The proof was now written in human tissue, in the ruined architecture of livers that had been processing a supposedly safe material for years. The paradox at the center of this crisis was not lost on those who cared to look closely. Polyvinyl chloride had been aggressively marketed as a hygienic, inert, food-safe material. PVC films wrapped meats in supermarket coolers. PVC pipes carried drinking water into kitchens and bathrooms. PVC blood bags, praised for their flexibility and durability, had revolutionized transfusion medicine, making glass bottles obsolete. Children's toys were molded from brightly colored, phthalate, softened PVC that toddlers would chew without a second thought. The material presented itself as a triumph of modern chemistry, a solid, stable container for the conveniences of civilian life. Yet the gas from which it was made, the invisible precursor locked into the polymer chain, had been quietly registering its presence in the bodies of the men who manufactured it. The safety of the product was purchased with a currency that had not appeared on any balance sheet. In the years before Creech's observation, the men themselves had noticed signs. Some recalled a strange lethargy that settled into the bones after a shift, a dull ache in the upper right quadrant of the abdomen that they attributed to bad posture or aging. A few had developed Raynaud's phenomenon, fingers turning white and numb in cold weather, a sign of vascular damage that was later linked to vinyl chloride's effect on small blood vessels. But industrial medicine of the era was not designed to ask questions that might embarrass the employer. Company doctors treated symptoms, filed reports, and returned the men to the line. The cost of inquiry was high, and the men who could have asked were not the ones who would pay the price. Creech's cluster triggered a crisis across the global PVC industry. Within weeks of the public announcement, plant managers from West Virginia to West Germany were scrambling to test their air, their workers, and their liability exposure. Share prices dipped. Congressional hearings were scheduled. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which had been operating under the lenient standard of 500 parts per million as an allowable exposure ceiling, was suddenly forced to contend with the fact that the gas caused a cancer that killed almost everyone who contracted it. Angiosarcoma of the liver is rarely operable, rarely responsive to chemotherapy, and carries a median survival measured in months, not years. The men who had already been diagnosed were, in a clinical sense, beyond the reach of remedy. The question that remained was, how many more were walking around with the seeds of the same tumor already planted in their hepatic tissue, waiting for the right cellular error to bloom? The answer came slowly, but the direction was clear. Maltoni's rat studies, now impossible to ignore, demonstrated that there was no observable safe dose in his model. Even at the lowest concentrations, tumors appeared. The liver, the organ that had been entrusted with the body's detoxification, was being betrayed by its own biochemical machinery. The same evolutionary gift that allowed humans to digest plant alkaloids and clear pharmaceutical waste was converting a simple 2-carbon molecule into a molecular burglar, one that slipped through the cell's defenses and rewrote the locks from the inside. The atmosphere in the Louisville plant, in the weeks after the news broke, was one of stunned silence, punctuated by bursts of anger. Workers who had spent 20 years breathing the air around the reactors began to understand their fatigue, their aches, their strange vascular symptoms, not as the normal wear of a working life, but as the down payment on a debt they had never agreed to incur. Union representatives demanded medical surveillance, lifetime health monitoring, and compensation for the families of the dead. The company, after initial resistance, began to negotiate. The settlement patterns that emerged would become a template for a generation of toxic tort litigation, but they could not restore liver function, could not undo the DNA adducts already formed, could not give back the years that the disease would subtract. The glove in the steel pan, the one that carried the faint odor of monomer, was not an anomaly. It was a leakage from the sealed world of industrial chemistry into the sterile theater of medicine. The PVC blood bag that had been used in the surgery was, in a material sense, a miracle: flexible, durable, resistant to bacterial penetration, cheap enough to throw away after a single use. It had saved countless lives, including perhaps the life of the man on the table that morning. But the miracle had a lineage, and the lineage had a cost that had been paid elsewhere, by other bodies, in the quiet of a Kentucky factory town where the air itself had become a slow poison. The story that began in Creech's operating room did not end with the establishment of a safer workplace standard or the recognition of vinyl chloride as a Group 1 carcinogen by the International Agency for Research on Cancer. It continued into the pipes and siding panels of millions of homes, into the residual monomer that would gradually off-gas from new flooring, into the drinking water that traveled through PVC conduits. The men who had worked the reactors had served as unwitting sentinels, their livers performing the epidemiological work that no ethics committee would ever have approved in a clinical trial. The data they provided, written in tumor registries and death certificates, proved what the rats had already suggested. The gas was not a nuisance. It was a carcinogen that had been hiding in plain sight, wrapped in the plastic conveniences of a comfortable century. The glove was discarded, sterilized, and forgotten. The patient recovered. The operating room returned to its rhythm. But the faint, sweetish odor that had clung to the rubber for a few minutes after the surgery was a message that had taken decades to decode, and by the time anyone could read it clearly, the ink had already dried inside the cells of the men who had written it without ever knowing they held the pen. The number that had once been considered safe was 500. 500 parts of vinyl chloride gas for every million parts of air. That was the standard American workers breathed under until the winter of 1974, a figure carried forward from an earlier era when the compound was still regarded as a laboratory nuisance, a Swedish ether that might give a man a headache but not a grave. The number had the weight of tradition, which in industrial hygiene often means the weight of guesswork dressed in the language of settled science. In Louisville, Kentucky, the B.F. Goodrich plant had been running polymerization reactors for decades, great steel vessels where vinyl chloride monomer was heated under pressure with catalysts until it transformed into the white powder known as polyvinyl chloride. The men who worked the reactor floors knew the smell. They knew it the way a mill worker knows the scent of hot grease, or a miner knows the taste of coal dust at the back of the throat. It was a faint chloroform-like sweetness, so familiar that it barely registered as a warning. When the angiosarcoma diagnoses began to surface in January of 1974, 4 cases of a cancer so rare it normally appeared in 1 human being out of 30 million, the first response from the company was disbelief. The second was a calculation. If vinyl chloride caused cancer, And if the proof came from their own workers, then the cost of that proof would be measured not in laboratory glassware, but in regulatory compliance, liability judgments, and the future of the entire PVC industry. What followed was a 16-month compression of scientific discovery and political negotiation that normally takes decades. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, an agency barely 4 years old, moved with a speed that startled both industry and labor. In April of 1974, OSHA proposed an emergency temporary standard, dropping the permissible exposure limit from 500 parts per million to 50. By October, after hearings in which company executives warned of economic ruin, the agency tightened the number again to 1 part per million, averaged over an 8-hour shift. By 1976, an action level of half a part per million had been set, 1/1000th of the original threshold, and the industry that had predicted its own extinction was instead installing closed-loop systems, leak detectors, and continuous monitors that soon proved the new standard was achievable. The cost of compliance, it turned out, was not the cost of survival. The cost had simply been shifted for a generation onto the bodies of the men who had worked under the old number. But the American regulatory machinery, for all its abruptness, was not operating alone. Across the Atlantic, in a converted monastery in the Bentivoglio countryside near Bologna, a physician named Cesare Maltoni had already been asking the same question for years, and he had been asking it with a rigor that made the Louisville cluster look like a tragic but belated confirmation. Maltoni was not an industry consultant. He was not a government epidemiologist. He was the director of the Bologna Institute of Oncology, and he had designed an experiment of a scale that no one had attempted before for an industrial chemical. He exposed rats to vinyl chloride gas at concentrations ranging from 10,000 parts per million down to 50, then down to 25, then down to 10, then down to 5, then down to 1. He kept the animals in clean cages, fed them measured diets, and waited. He waited until their livers failed, until their kidneys grew tumors, until the blood vessels inside their lungs and brains and spleens developed the same angiosarcoma that would later appear in the Kentucky workers. By the time he published his cumulative results, he had examined more than 17,500 rats, making it the largest animal carcinogenicity study ever conducted for a single substance up to that moment. The findings were devastating in their clarity. At 500 parts per million, the old workplace threshold, the rats developed tumors so aggressively that the question was not whether vinyl chloride was a carcinogen, but how it had ever been considered otherwise. At 50 parts per million, tumors still appeared. At 10, at 5, at 1 part per million, the biological response persisted. In Maltoni's model, there was no observable safe dose. The dose-response curve did not flatten into a harmless background. It simply continued, attenuated but unbroken, a line that moved through the data with the quiet insistence of a chemical that did not know how to stop. The rat cages in Bentivoglio were kept in a room where a speaker played a constant loop of white noise. This detail, small and strange, was not an accident of equipment but a deliberate choice. Maltoni understood that sound, voices, footsteps, the distant vibration of a truck on the road, could introduce stress variables into the experiment, confounding the tumor counts with cortisol and adrenaline. The white noise was a blanket, a layer of sensory control, but it also served a second, unspoken purpose. It masked the sound of the industries that had already decided the results before the final tumor counts were in. The chemical manufacturers in Italy and the United States had been briefed on Maltoni's preliminary data as early as 1972, and their internal memoranda, later uncovered in litigation, showed a pattern of preemptive dismissal. The rats were dosed too high. The exposure route was artificial. The findings could not be extrapolated to humans. The same arguments that had been used against occupational disease research since the match factories of Victorian London were being rehearsed again, their language updated for the age of polymer chemistry. The strange part was not that the industry resisted. The strange part was that the mechanism of resistance was itself a mirror of the molecular problem. Just as the body developed elaborate defenses against foreign chemicals, so the economic body of PVC manufacturing developed elaborate defenses against the recognition of harm. And just as the body's defenses, under the right conditions, could become the instrument of its own undoing, so the industrial apparatus, in its effort to protect itself from liability, was systematically producing the conditions for a far larger and slower liability, the contamination of an entire planet with a substance whose dangers were now undeniable. The shift that occurred between 1974 and 1976 was not simply a reduction in a regulatory number. It was a transformation in how scientists understood the relationship between a molecule and a living system. Before Louisville, before Bentivoglio, the debate was whether vinyl chloride could cause cancer at all. Afterward, the debate became how. The answer lay in the liver, in a family of enzymes known as cytochrome P450, which had evolved over millions of years to oxidize foreign compounds, plant alkaloids, fungal toxins, the chemical debris of a million ecological encounters, and render them water-soluble enough for excretion. These enzymes were the liver's general-purpose detoxification crew, versatile and indiscriminate. When a molecule of vinyl chloride entered the bloodstream and reached the hepatocytes, the P450 enzymes attacked it with an oxygen atom, intending to prepare it for safe elimination. But the product of that well-intentioned oxidation was not a harmless metabolite. It was chloroethylene oxide, a reactive epoxide, a molecule with a strained three-membered ring that sought to open itself by bonding with anything nearby, and the anything nearby inside a liver cell was DNA. The epoxide slipped into the double helix and formed an adduct, a covalent bond with one of the nucleotide bases, most frequently guanine. The altered base during the next round of cell division was read incorrectly by the DNA polymerase. A guanine that should have paired with a cytosine paired instead with a thymine. A single letter in the genetic code was swapped. And if that swap occurred in a gene that regulated cell growth, a tumor suppressor, an oncogene, the cell began to divide without restraint. The liver enzymes had not detoxified the vinyl chloride. They had activated it. They had taken an inert, simple molecule and transformed it into a chemical scalpel that cut, with statistical patience, at the genome. This was the paradox that sat at the center of Maltoni's data, though it took years for the full molecular picture to emerge. The body's ancient defense system, honed by evolution against the natural toxins of the living world, had no category for a synthetic gas that had not existed until 1835. It processed the molecule according to its own biochemical logic, and the result was a self-inflicted carcinogenesis. The accomplice was not a poison slipped in from outside. The accomplice was the liver's own machinery, doing exactly what it had been designed to do, on a substrate it had never been designed to encounter. The white noise in the Bentivoglio laboratory played on, covering the sound of that irony. Covering, too, the sound of industry lawyers reading the same studies and reaching a different conclusion, that if no safe dose could be proven, then no dose could be proven unsafe at the levels found outside factory gates. The threshold had moved from 500 to 1, but the logic of thresholds was itself under attack. A carcinogen without a known safe level could not be banned. It could only be managed. And management meant containment, better seals, better pipes, better rail cars, without ever confronting the possibility that containment was a temporary condition, not a permanent solution. A rat cage is a small universe. It holds food, water, bedding, and a measured atmosphere. In Moltoni's cages, the atmosphere contained vinyl chloride at precisely controlled concentrations, and the rats breathed it for 4 hours a day, 5 days a week, for 52 weeks. Then they lived out the rest of their natural lives under observation. The tumors that appeared in their livers and lungs and blood vessels were cataloged with a monastic attention to detail, each one a data point in a curve that refused to touch zero. The cages were cleaned. The bodies were necropsied. The white noise continued. And outside the monastery walls, the world that had commissioned the study went on producing the gas at a scale that made the experimental exposures look like a child's chemistry set. By the time OSHA's final standard took effect, the PVC industry had absorbed the regulatory shock and discovered that the closed-loop technologies they had claimed were impossible were, in fact, entirely feasible. The cost of retrofitting plants was high, but not ruinous. The prediction that the PVC sector would collapse under the weight of compliance was, like so many industrial doomsday prophecies, an overstatement born of bargaining position rather than engineering reality. The workers who had already been exposed, however, could not be retrofitted. The angiosarcomas that had already been seeded could not be recalled. The men in Louisville and the other plants who had inhaled the Swedish vapor for years under the 500 part per million standard carried the adducts in their liver cells, and the latency period for that type of cancer could stretch beyond 2 decades. The threshold had moved, but the past was fixed. The discovery did not end the story. It made the story portable. Once the mechanism was understood, chloroethylene oxide, DNA adducts, miscoding, mutation, it could be applied to any exposure scenario, any population, any concentration. The 1 part per million standard was not a guarantee of safety. It was a statement of acceptable risk, a social contract written in the language of parts per billion and excess lifetime cancer deaths. And the negotiation of that contract would occupy the next 50 years. Through arguments about PVC water pipes and vinyl siding and the off-gassing of new shower curtains, through the slow accumulation of part per trillion vinyl chloride in the drinking water of subdivisions that had never heard of Louisville or Bentivoglio, through the quiet trade-off that every modern convenience exacts from the bodies that enjoy it. In the monastery at Bentivoglio, the white noise generator hummed through the night. The rats slept. The tumors grew or did not grow according to a logic that was already, by then, fully legible to anyone willing to read it. The data was there, in the notebooks, in the tissue slides, in the statistical tables. What remained was the decision about what to do with the knowledge. And that decision, as always, would be made not in the laboratory, but in the boardrooms, and the regulatory hearing chambers, and the editorial offices, where the threshold between evidence and action proved just as elusive as the threshold between a safe dose and a carcinogenic one. The number kept moving because the science kept advancing. But the bodies that had already been counted remained where they were, fixed in the archive, their livers preserved in formalin, their medical records marked with a cancer that should not have existed. The sound you hear is not the water, it is the pipe. A low, hollow note runs through the walls of the house, a signature of modern plumbing that no one alive in 1987 remembered learning. It was simply there, like the refrigerator hum or the furnace's winter click, a background frequency absorbed into domestic expectation. But if you pressed your ear to the cold white polyvinyl chloride riser in the basement of that Toledo tract home, you would catch a faint, high-pitched whistle riding beneath the flow, the voice of a material exhaling something it was never supposed to release. The house was new, the mortgage fresh, the water clear by every municipal measure. The pipe, however, was only technically sealed. This was the deal we made with the pipeline, not the one we signed, but the one we inherited. To understand its terms, you have to go back to the winter of 1974, when the angiosarcoma cluster in Louisville tore the mask off vinyl chloride and the PVC industry found itself staring into a regulatory abyss. The chemical was a proven human carcinogen. The workforce was exposed. The product was everywhere. The immediate response was not denial, but containment, a frantic, expensive, and genuinely transformative engineering campaign to trap the gas before it reached human lungs. What emerged was the closed-loop technology, reactor systems that captured unreacted vinyl chloride monomer, scrubbed it from exhaust streams, condensed it back into liquid, and piped it into storage. The numbers were staggering in their success. Workplace concentrations that had hovered at hundreds of parts per million collapsed to single digits, then to fractions of a part per million. Within a few years, the air inside a PVC plant was cleaner than anyone in 1970 would have thought possible. The acute danger, the kind that carved tumors into the livers of men still in their 40s, was being brought under control. The industry had done what regulation demanded and what engineering permitted. The problem, as far as the production floor was concerned, had been solved. But the gas did not disappear. It merely moved. In a closed-loop system, the captured vinyl chloride monomer is not destroyed. It is recovered, stored in refrigerated pressure vessels, and eventually transported to another polymerization plant where it will be turned into more PVC. The loop closes chemically, but it opens geographically. The gas that once hovered over Louisville now rode inside insulated tank cars across the flatlands of Indiana and Ohio, through the switch yards of small cities whose names rarely appeared in federal registries. It traveled in pipelines buried beneath cornfields and industrial parks, their welds checked on maintenance schedules that balanced cost against corrosion. The risk had not been eliminated. It had been spread so thin across the map that it became a matter of statistics rather than headlines. Every rail car of vinyl chloride monomer that moved through a populated area carried the potential energy of a Louisville reactor leak, but distributed, diffused, and deferred. The industry had traded a concentrated occupational hazard for a diluted environmental one, and everyone involved understood the logic. Better a 1 in 1,000 chance scattered over 1,000 communities than a certainty inside a single factory. This was not a conspiracy. It was an actuarial optimization that every regulatory agency of the era accepted as progress. The catch hid inside the homes the product filled. The same engineering triumph that locked vinyl chloride inside the reactor could not entirely lock it inside the finished plastic. The polymerization process, the chemical stitching of vinyl chloride molecules into long chains of PVC is never perfectly complete. A tiny fraction of monomer remains trapped in the rigid matrix, like bubbles of air frozen inside ice. When the resin is molded into pipes, siding, window frames, or blood bags, those residual molecules come along for the ride. They are measured in parts per million, sometimes parts per billion, but they are there, and they are mobile. Given time and heat, they work their way to the surface and escape. Sunlight on vinyl siding can warm the material enough to release a faint vapor. Hot water running through PVC pipes can accelerate the migration into the very substance the pipe was designed to deliver. The plastic that was supposed to separate the dangerous raw material from the consumer had become, in effect, a slow-release membrane, leaking the ghost of the original gas into the air and water of daily life. In the 1980s, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency began to run the numbers on what this meant. Their researchers took lengths of PVC pipe, filled them with water, let them sit, and measured what leached out. The results were chilling in their precision, if not in their magnitude. Vinyl chloride migrated into the water at concentrations in the low parts per trillion. Those are vanishingly small quantities, drops in an ocean of tap water, quantities so minute they required gas chromatographs of exquisite sensitivity to detect at all. A single part per trillion is 1 second in 32,000 years. It is the weight of a postage stamp on a fleet of aircraft carriers. It is, by every intuitive measure, nothing. The EPA's risk model, however, was not built on intuition. It was built on the linear no-threshold hypothesis, which assumes that any exposure to a carcinogen carries some probability of harm, however small. Using the animal data from Maltoni's rat studies and the human data from the Louisville cohort, the agency calculated that a lifetime of drinking water containing vinyl chloride at a few parts per trillion would produce 1 additional case of cancer for every 1,000,000 people exposed. That is the 1E6 risk level, a number so low it barely registers as a public health concern. A statistical whisper lost in the background noise of 1,000,000 lives ending for 1,000,000 other reasons. The agency classified this risk as acceptable. The word matters. Acceptable does not mean zero. It means that the cost of doing better, of replacing every PVC water main in America, of retooling the plastics industry to eliminate residual monomer entirely, of sacrificing the corrosion resistance and low cost that had made PVC the default infrastructure for a generation, was judged to outweigh the benefit of preventing 1 theoretical cancer case in a population the size of a small city. The calculation was rational, transparent, and documented in the gray-page dockets of the Federal Register. Nobody hid the math. The math simply contained an implicit choice that the bodies of future statistical unknowns could be budgeted against the present convenience of millions. It was the same logic that had governed the closed-loop migration, repeated at a finer scale. Distribute the risk so evenly, so invisibly, that it dissolves into the texture of normal life. 1 extra cancer per 1,000,000. A figure that fits comfortably in a footnote, that no politician would lose an election over, that no newspaper would run on the front page. A number small enough to vanish, large enough to carry a name somewhere, someday, that would never appear in the actuarial tables as cause and effect. The Toledo kitchen sink is the monument to this mathematics. In 1987, a family moved into that house on a street of similar houses, its lot scraped from former farmland, Its plumbing, a network of white PVC installed by a contractor who bought the cheapest approved materials and never read a material safety data sheet for vinyl chloride. The first rush of water in the morning carried a faint plastic taste, a slight sweetish note that most residents attributed to new pipes and forgot within a week. The taste was the residual monomer, announcing itself at concentrations far below any acute toxicity threshold, but present nonetheless. No federal limit existed for vinyl chloride in drinking water. At that point, the Safe Drinking Water Act would eventually address it, but the standard would be set at 2 parts per billion, a level 1,000 times higher than the parts per trillion leaching the EPA had already measured and deemed acceptable. The family in Toledo was protected by law, but the law protected them against a concentration that no one's water actually contained. The actual exposure, the chronic, low-level whisper of a carcinogen, fell into the gap between measurement and regulation. It was legal. It was safe by all operational definitions. It was also a small, continuous experiment in lifetime toxicology, running silently through every glass of water, every pot of coffee, every bath drawn for a child. The pipeline that ended at that kitchen faucet was not the one that crossed the country carrying liquefied monomer. It was the pipeline of consequence. The invisible causeway that ran from the laboratories of the 1830s to the chemical plants of the 1940s to the union halls and surgical theaters of the 1970s to the building codes and cost-benefit analyses of the 1980s, and finally to the lips of a woman in Ohio who rinsed her coffee pot and thought the water smelled a little strange, but trusted that the city had tested it. That trust was not misplaced. The city had tested it. The tests looked for lead, for coliform bacteria, for turbidity, for the acute threats that had killed people visibly and urgently in earlier decades. They did not test for vinyl chloride at parts per trillion, because no regulation required it, because the risk was acceptable, because the entire structure of American environmental law is built on the idea that safety is a threshold, not a continuum. The water was clean. The water was also a solvent for the slow, patient logic of a molecule that had never agreed to the terms of its captivity. The strange part was not that the pipe leached. The strange part was that we had collectively decided to call the leaching permissible, to enshrine an acceptable cancer in the code books, to price a future life at a discount rate determined by the Office of Management and Budget. The decision was never put to a vote. It emerged from the machinery of regulatory science the way a sum emerges from a calculator, inevitable, correct in its internal logic, and completely blind to the human texture of what it counted. The mother in Toledo who filled a sippy cup with that faintly sweet water could not have found, in any public library of 1987, a document explaining that the pipe itself was slowly shedding a Group 1 carcinogen into her child's drink. The documents existed, but they were written in the language of risk assessment, a dialect engineered to be precise without being alarming, to communicate numeric confidence without narrative consequence. She would have needed to know the code, part per trillion, linear no threshold, 1E6, to decode the silence in her own kitchen. So the deal was sealed. Acute industrial death had been traded for chronic, ambient, statistically invisible exposure. The workers who had inhaled vinyl chloride by the part per 100 were now protected by monitoring badges and scrubber alarms. The public, in exchange, received a molecular tithe, a tax on modern comfort, too small to protest, too diffuse to organize around, too thoroughly normalized to even notice. Every PVC pipe laid in the ground after 1980 was a treaty signed not with any government, but with a distribution curve. The gas would remain contained, mostly. The plastic would remain stable, mostly. The risk would remain hidden entirely. And the pipeline, the network of rail lines and tank farms and industrial mains and kitchen faucets, would hum its quiet, continuous note, a song of molecules migrating from solid to liquid to body, a song whose chorus was always the same. This is the cost, this is the cost, this is the cost, and you have already paid it. The jacket hung in the station locker like a document nobody had signed. It belonged to a firefighter in Ville Platte, Louisiana, a man who had answered a call in 2011 when a tank car split open on a siding and the air turned to something that made the eyes feel like two small wounds. 3 years later, that jacket still carried the scent, not of smoke exactly, but of a Swedish, bleach-edged ghost, a chemical signature that refused to wash out. It was a private archive of a fire that had never really ended, because the molecules that clung to the fabric were not soot. They were the incombustible residue of a material that had been sold to the world as flame-resistant and had kept its word in a way no one had bargained for. To understand why the jacket never forgot, you have to understand what polyvinyl chloride does when it burns and what it refuses to do. PVC is roughly 57% chlorine by weight, borrowed from common salt through an electrochemical sleight of hand. That chlorine is what gives the plastic its reluctance to ignite. In a fire, the long polymer chains break, and the chlorine atoms peel away as hydrogen chloride gas, an invisible, acrid vapor that snuffs out the combustion radicals trying to feed the flame. It is a self-extinguishing mechanism, a built-in firefighter. This is why electricians wrap cables in it, why hospitals run IV tubes through it, why builders fit it into walls and window frames. It will not catch fire easily, and if it does, it will try to put itself out. On a laboratory bench, held over a Bunsen burner, the material blackens, chars, and falls silent. It does not drip flame. It earns its safety rating. But the silence is a transaction, not a gift. The hydrogen chloride gas, once released, does not disappear. It meets the moisture in the air, the humidity of a Louisiana afternoon or an Ohio night, and it forms hydrochloric acid, a mist of microscopic acid droplets light enough to drift, heavy enough to settle into the delicate membrane of the alveoli. A first responder draws a breath and feels not heat, but a sharp, progressive tightening, as if the lungs are being slowly polished with a dry cloth. An hour later, the cough begins. By morning, the throat feels like cracked mortar. The acid doesn't just irritate. It reacts with the water in the tissue to corrode, leaving behind chemical burns that take weeks to heal, and sometimes, in the deeply exposed, segue into a permanent hypersensitivity that no pension board knows how to classify. And that is only the beginning of what the fire releases. At certain temperatures, above 600 degrees Celsius, in the turbulent heart of a burning warehouse or a pool fire under a rail car, the decomposition chemistry takes a darker turn. The carbon rings rearrange themselves, and the chlorine atoms insert into positions that nature never intended, but that are remarkably stable once formed. The result is a family of compounds called polychlorinated dibenzodioxins and furans. These molecules are so toxic that their presence is measured in parts per trillion, and at that scale, they still matter. They do not attack the lungs. They settle into the soil, bind to fat, and accumulate in the food chain with a patience that outstrips any human regulatory timetable. The fire resistance that kept the house from burning down for an extra 8 minutes has now seeded the ground with compounds that will remain biologically active for a decade or more inside any body that accidentally ingests them. One risk was traded for another, but the second risk had no visible flame and no alarm to ring. The Louisville fire of 1978 is the archival marker for how this trade-off played out at scale. It happened at a PVC manufacturing facility, one of those industrial cathedrals where vinyl chloride monomer was piped in liquid form and converted into the white powder that would be shipped, melted, and molded into pipes, siding, and records. A leak, an ignition source, the precise sequence remains filed in a legal deposition somewhere, and suddenly, a plume of hydrogen chloride gas rolled into the surrounding neighborhoods. Thousands of residents were evacuated. First responders went in without the kind of respiratory protection that now seems obvious, and they came out with burns in their airways that would not heal cleanly. The lawsuits that followed were thick with medical testimony, lung function tests, bronchoscopies, descriptive accounts of men who had been healthy at the start of their shift, and, by the end, were breathing like heavy smokers who had never touched a cigarette. The chemical company settled. The insurers recalibrated their actuarial tables. And then, as almost always happened, the legislative inquiry lost momentum. No new regulation was passed governing the distance between a monomer storage sphere and a residential cul-de-sac. The argument was that the incident was a rare exception, an industrial accident of the type that modern safety protocols had already rendered impossible again. The town went back to its routines, and the only trace that remained was in the medical records of the firefighters, filed away in a hospital basement that flooded in 1997, erasing part of the paper trail, but not the memory inside the chests of the men. What makes the Louisville fire significant now, in the context of a story that marches toward a much later disaster in East Palestine, is the pattern it established. Every serious vinyl chloride fire became a kind of natural experiment that nobody collected. Between 2000 and 2022, federal transportation records logged at least 27 train derailments in the United States that involved cars carrying vinyl chloride monomer. 27 moments when a wheel climbed a rail, or a coupling sheared, or a track buckled under a heat wave, and suddenly a pressurized vessel of liquefied gas found itself at an angle it was never designed to hold. Some of those derailments led to controlled releases, some led to fires. In a few, the cars were breached, and the gas ignited spontaneously, creating a torch-like flame that burned for hours while emergency crews, bound by protocol, stood at a perimeter and watched. The fumes drifted over small towns in Arkansas, over a strip mall in Pennsylvania, over a grain elevator in Nebraska. People went to the hospital with burning eyes and nausea. A few communities filed formal complaints. None of those incidents triggered a mandatory, federally funded longitudinal health study. The patchwork of local health departments, each underfunded and trained for restaurant inspections rather than toxicological epidemiology, collected what they could: anecdotal reports, a spike in respiratory visits, a cluster of rashes. But without the statistical power to demonstrate an imminent hazard, the federal machinery of permanent regulation did not engage. The fires were treated as acute events, contained, extinguished, forgotten, while the question of what was accumulating in the bodies of the people who lived downwind remained unanswered, because no agency had the authority to ask it in a systematic way. The firefighter in Ville Platte understood this without needing to read the toxicological literature. He knew it from the way his jacket still smelled. 3 years after that 2011 call, like a chemistry lab that someone had tried to air out but never quite could. The odor was not strong enough to be called a stench. It was a presence, a faint, chlorinated sharpness that became noticeable in the damp, or when the locker room was quiet, or when a new guy, fresh from the academy, would wrinkle his nose and ask what that smell was. The jacket had been washed, hung to dry in the sun, even run through a commercial extractor at an equipment servicing company. The smell returned. It clung to the fabric because the volatile organochlorine compounds had dissolved into the synthetic fibers of the jacket itself, forming a kind of secondary solution that off-gassed at its own slow, logarithmic pace. It was, in a very literal sense, a sample of the fire preserved in the equipment. A personal archive that the firefighter carried into every new call. A reminder, though he would not have put it this way, that the boundary between the emergency and the aftermath was not a line in time, but a gradient in chemistry. The paradox at the center of all this is that PVC was not chosen despite its fire behavior, but largely because of it. The chlorine that makes it resistant to ignition is the very atom that makes its smoke so corrosive, so capable of generating dioxins under the right thermal conditions. It is a material that, in a fire, protects the structure at the cost of the lungs of anyone trapped inside or fighting the blaze. And because most fires do not reach the temperatures required for significant dioxin formation, because most PVC objects simply sit quietly in walls, conduits, and hospital tubing for decades, the trade-off remained invisible, folded into the actuarial logic that declared the material safe enough. The long, low smoldering that poisons the ground and the memory of safety is not a failure of PVC. It is a feature that only reveals itself when the containment is broken. And because containment is broken one accident at a time, in widely scattered locations, its cost has never been totaled into a single column. The bill is paid in isolated installments: a firefighter's reduced lung capacity, a creek bed where the benthic organisms carry a dioxin fingerprint, a town that still debates whether the headache cluster, the year after the railcar fire, was coincidence or causation. The jacket in the Ville Platte locker hangs there as a material witness to this uncollected debt. It does not accuse anyone in particular. It does not offer a moral. It simply persists, emitting its faint testament at a concentration too low to trigger an alarm but too persistent to ignore. If you were to seal that jacket in a clean glass jar and ship it to an analytical chemist, you would find trace levels of chlorinated compounds that match the signature of a vinyl chloride fire, not a generic house fire, not a brush fire, but specifically the incomplete combustion of PVC. The chemist could tell you the parts per million, could trace the molecular fingerprint back to the chlorine atoms that originated in a salt deposit somewhere, probably in Louisiana itself, where brine wells pump up the raw material for the chlor-alkali plant that feeds the vinyl chloride monomer reactor. The whole cycle is there, in a single piece of stained turnout gear: salt, electricity, a polymer reactor, a rail car, a derailment, a fire, and a set of human lungs that never signed a consent form, but became participants in the experiment nonetheless. What the archive knows, and what the jacket encodes, is that the fires we couldn't control were not aberrations. They were the price of a technology that worked so well in normal conditions that no one wanted to add the cost of failure to the spreadsheet. Each of those 27 derailments and the many other incidents that went unrecorded because the spill was small or the fire was quickly extinguished was a stress test that the system passed in the narrow, technical sense that the tank cars did not explode. But the human cost, measured across time rather than a single night, was never tallied because the mechanisms for tallying it did not exist. The Environmental Protection Agency has a standard for what it calls acceptable risk, one extra cancer case per million population exposed over a lifetime. But that standard requires knowing the exposure, calculating the dose, and tracking the population for decades. For the people downwind of a vinyl chloride fire, none of those conditions were met. They simply lived their lives, and if a few more of them developed a rare cancer, the statistical anomaly was too small to be visible in the noise of a small-town demographic. And so the archive of these fires is maintained not by government agencies, but by objects. A jacket that won't give up its smell, a medical file with a note about reactive airway disease, a jar of soil from a backyard that a worried resident sent to a university lab, which reported back a dioxin level that was slightly above background but not, the letter said, an immediate health concern. These pieces of evidence are scattered, unstandardized, legally inadmissible. They do not cohere into a narrative that can change a regulation. But they are true, in the way that a persistent odor is true, in the way that a cough that began the morning after the fire and never quite left is true. They are the archive of the body, the archive of the ground, maintained at a molecular level that no court can subpoena, but that no settlement can erase. The firefighter in Ville Platte eventually retired. He took the jacket home, hung it in a garage, and it still smelled 7 years later when he pulled it out to show a journalist who had come asking questions about the derailment up in Ohio. The journalist, who had read all the accident reports and compiled a spreadsheet of every vinyl chloride release on American railways, lifted the jacket to her face and inhaled without thinking. She flinched. The smell was not overpowering, but it was precise. It was the smell of something that had been designed not to burn and had almost kept its promise. The night of February 3rd began with a sound that older residents of East Palestine would later compare to a freight elevator dropping through its shaft, a long metallic tearing that traveled not through the air, but through the ground, vibrating up through floor joists and chair legs, through the soles of shoes and the bones of the inner ear. The Norfolk Southern train 32N, 151 cars long and weighing over 18,000 tons, had been moving at roughly 47 miles per hour along a stretch of track that curved gently through the village's eastern edge. At 8:55 p.m., a wheel bearing on the 23rd car overheated to a temperature that would later be recorded by a wayside detector at 253 degrees above ambient, hot enough to melt its own lubricant and begin the process of mechanical unraveling. 38 cars left the rails. 11 of them were pressure tank cars carrying vinyl chloride monomer, the refrigerated liquid form of a gas that had been manufactured 400 miles away and was now resting in cylindrical steel vessels, each holding roughly 34,000 gallons, waiting for the journey to end at a polymerization plant in Pennsylvania. The cars did not immediately rupture. That fact matters. The tank cars were built to the .105 specification, with half-inch thick steel shells, thermal insulation, and protective outer jackets designed to withstand puncture and fire exposure. What they were not designed to withstand was the precise geometry of this derailment. Cars piling into each other like thrown dominoes, couplers piercing neighboring vessels, steel tearing steel with the slow, grinding force of accumulated momentum. The hissing that followed, audible from the porches of homes along Taggart Street, was the sound of pressure relief valves doing exactly what they were engineered to do, releasing gas in controlled bursts to prevent the tanks from becoming bombs. But engineering calculations are performed in clean rooms, not in the tangled wreckage of a derailment where multiple cars are leaking simultaneously, where open flames from other burning chemicals, butyl acrylate, ethylene glycol, monobutyl ether lick at the sides of vinyl chloride cars, where the ambient temperature in the pile of twisted metal climbs hour by hour toward a threshold that changes the physics of everything. For 3 days, the situation remained a tense, smoldering equilibrium. Emergency responders from 3 states, railroad contractors, and federal environmental personnel gathered at a command post set up in the village fire station, a low brick building that suddenly found itself hosting decisions of a scale its floor plan had never anticipated. The vinyl chloride cars had temperature sensors, and the sensors showed numbers that climbed with the deliberateness of a fever chart: 120 degrees Fahrenheit, 140, 160. At each reading, the mathematical models were rerun. The concern was not merely that the cars would fail from heat exposure. It was that they would fail in a specific, catastrophic mode known as a boiling liquid, expanding vapor explosion, or BLEV. When a pressure vessel containing a liquid under pressure is heated beyond its design limits, the liquid can reach a temperature where the vessel's pressure rating is exceeded, and if the vessel ruptures, the entire contents flash into vapor in a fraction of a second. The resulting explosion is not a fireball from the chemical itself igniting, but a physical blast from the rapid phase change, capable of launching steel fragments the size of automobiles over a radius of a mile. A mile. That meant the entire village, and pieces of the village beyond it. The decision to perform a controlled vent and burn was made on the morning of February 6th, after the temperature on one car spiked in a way that the models interpreted as an accelerating threat of BLEV. The logic was clear, defensible, and terrible. By deliberately breaching the tanks, draining the liquid vinyl chloride into a prepared trench, and igniting it, the potential energy could be released in a controlled manner. A fire instead of an explosion, a plume instead of shrapnel. The railroad officials, consulting with the incident commander, gave the order. At 3:00 p.m., residents within a 1-mile radius were told to evacuate immediately. Many had only minutes. Some were already at work in neighboring towns and never received the notice. Others lived on streets where the door-to-door warnings never reached. A mother on East Martin Street would later describe grabbing her children and driving east without knowing where she was going, watching the mirror fill with a blackness that seemed to rise faster than any smoke had a right to. The breach was accomplished with explosive charges placed on the tanks at 4:37 p.m. The vinyl chloride, released from its pressurized containment, erupted outward as a liquid that boiled instantly upon contact with the air. Its boiling point is -13 degrees Celsius, far below the February chill of that afternoon. What met the ignition source was not a pool, but a cloud. And what rose above the bare trees of Columbiana County was not a flame, but a column of black, soot-laden smoke that swelled into a mushroom shape, dark at its core, orange lit at its margins. Visible from satellites that had never before been tasked with photographing this particular stretch of Ohio. The smoke carried hydrogen chloride, which is the gas that forms hydrochloric acid when it dissolves in the water of your lungs or the tears on your eyes. It carried phosgene, a compound that had been weaponized in the trenches of the First World War, smelling faintly of new-mown hay at low concentrations, a detail that chemists in the 1920s had recorded with clinical precision, noting how the pleasant odor preceded a delayed, lethal pulmonary edema. And it carried trace dioxins and furans, the unintended children of chlorinated combustion, molecules shaped like flat, stubborn keys that fit into cellular receptors in ways that decades of biological evolution have not learned to eject. The wind on February 6th was from the northwest, blowing across the derailment site at roughly 10 miles per hour, carrying the plume directly over the village and its roughly 4,700 residents, over the elementary school and the Dollar General and the Little Beaver Creek, over Sulphur Run, whose name suddenly became a literal description, over the gas station and the cemetery and the water treatment plant whose intake was suspended too late to prevent a pulse of contamination from entering the distribution system. The fire burned for hours, and when it was finished, the 5 tanks had been reduced to charred steel shells lying in the melted snow, and the emergency had officially transitioned from a threat of explosion to a threat of exposure. In the days that followed, the Ohio Department of Natural Resources began the grim arithmetic of the spill's aquatic impact. Biologists walked the banks of Leslie Run and Bull Creek, tributaries that fed into the Ohio River system, counting dead fish, dead salamanders, dead crayfish, dead aquatic insects. The final tally would reach roughly 43,000 individual animals across 7.5 miles of stream. The kills were not subtle. The vinyl chloride and its combustion byproducts had swept through the water column like a chemical scythe, and what washed ashore in the days after the burn were small, silent bodies whose gills and mucous membranes had encountered a substance for which evolution had prepared no defense. The water sampling that followed detected a shifting cocktail of volatile organic compounds, vinyl chloride itself, butyl acrylate, ethyl hexyl acrylate, at concentrations that varied hour by hour, sample site by sample site, producing a dataset more fragmented than illuminating. The Environmental Protection Agency deployed its ASPEC plane, a C-130 Hercules modified for aerial chemical surveillance, which flew a grid pattern over the area and reported that the concentrations in the air were below levels of concern for short-term health effects. It is important to understand what those words meant. Short-term referred to acute toxicity, the immediate traumatic consequences of high-dose exposure, burning lungs, fluid-filled lungs, loss of consciousness, death. The EPA's thresholds for acute exposure are based on studies of industrial accidents, animal testing, and occupational limits, and they are designed to answer a single question: will this concentration kill you today? The air in East Palestine in the weeks after the burn did not kill anyone today. But the question that went unanswered, the question that no agency had, the equipment, the mandate, or the political footing to ask, was what the air would do to the 4,700 people who breathed it over the course of weeks, months, and the accumulated years of a life that had been interrupted by a single afternoon. The long-term cancer risk from dioxins, the subtle neurological effects from chronic low-level vinyl chloride exposure, the synergistic toxicity of the complex mixture that had settled into the carpets, the curtains, the soil, the cisterns. None of this was part of the immediate monitoring plan, because no immediate monitoring plan is designed to capture what takes a decade to unfold. The discrepancy between the official measurements and lived experience began to widen almost instantly. Residents who returned to their homes after the evacuation order was lifted on February 9th reported a constellation of symptoms that medical toxicologists would later describe as consistent with chemical irritant exposure: burning eyes that over-the-counter drops could not soothe, sore throats that persisted for weeks, a cough that came and went like an uninvited memory, rashes that bloomed on the skin of children and adults alike, and, most peculiarly, a metallic taste that many described as like breathing bennies, a sharp, coppery sensation on the tongue that seemed to precede the smell of the chemical rather than follow it. The air monitoring stations, meanwhile, continued to report concentrations measured in parts per billion. too low to trigger acute health advisories, too episodic to generate a cumulative exposure profile, and too disconnected from the specific locations where people slept, ate, and worried to satisfy the people doing the sleeping, eating, and worrying. A child's toy left on a windowsill in a home near Sulphur Run survived the evacuation and the return, but when the family came back, they noticed that its plastic surface had taken on a faint, irregular discoloration, a yellowing that followed the lines of the acid rain that had fallen the afternoon after the burn, etching a permanent record of the direction the wind had been blowing. The toy was not especially valuable or unique. It was a molded plastic figurine of the kind that accumulates in the corners of American childhood, manufactured in a factory that used, perhaps, PVC pellets from a polymerization plant not unlike the one that the derailed tank cars had been heading toward. The irony of that material connection was not lost on the parents, who placed the toy in a plastic bag and waited, along with their neighbors, for the test results from soil samples and water samples and air canisters that had been shipped to laboratories in other states. Results that would take weeks to process, months to confirm, and years to translate into anything resembling a medical prognosis. The structure of the weight was itself a kind of containment, an emotional analog of the closed-loop systems that the PVC industry had perfected in the 1970s. The uncertainty was held in place by the architecture of official response, the community meetings in the high school gymnasium, the information hotlines staffed by operators reading from scripts, the water well testing program that required homeowners to navigate a sequence of forms and scheduling, the preliminary health survey that collected symptoms but not serum dioxin levels, the press conferences in which spokespeople repeated the phrase, "below levels of concern," with the polish of repetition. None of this was malevolence. It was the machinery of public health emergency response operating exactly as it had been designed, which is to say, optimized for the containment of panic rather than the capture of slow-burning toxicological truth. The train that derailed in East Palestine was not an anomaly. It was a representative sample of the American hazardous materials transportation system, a rolling inventory of the substances that the economy has decided are necessary and the geography has decided must pass through someone's backyard. The vinyl chloride on that train was destined to become PVC pipe, siding, and medical tubing, the benign, solid, indispensable infrastructure of modern life. The molecule had been locked safely inside steel for the duration of its journey, just as it had been locked safely inside polymer chains for decades of use. But the seal had broken, and the contents had reverted to the form that the 19th century chemists had first encountered, a colorless, heavier-than-air vapor, drifting along drainage patterns, finding its way into basements and lungs and the dark, anaerobic sediments of creek beds, where it would wait in the company of the 43,000 dead and the generations yet to be counted. The emergency protocol had worked. The BLEV did not occur. No one was killed by shrapnel. But the protocol had performed a kind of alchemical transposition. It had converted the threat of a single, shattering instant into the reality of a long, distributed exposure, trading a visible catastrophe for an invisible one, an explosion for a plume, a moment for a decade. The energy that would have been released as kinetic force in flying steel was instead released as chemistry, and chemistry moves at its own pace, settling into soil and fat and groundwater with the patience of a compound that has no reason to hurry. The controlled burn had prevented a disaster that could be filmed and time-stamped and mourned in a single news cycle. What it had created instead was a disaster that would be measured in clinic visits and cancer registry entries, in the slow accumulation of symptoms that might, in the fullness of time, become recognizable only in retrospect, when the data finally cohered into a shape that the epidemiologists could name. The archive of the East Palestine derailment remains open and contested, its documents spread across the dockets of federal courts, the servers of environmental consulting firms, the filing cabinets of family physicians, and the notebooks of the high school science teacher who collected a glass jar of water from Sulphur Run in March 2023, noticed the white film separating from the sample, and placed it on a shelf under a note reading, "Run this next year. Next year has now arrived, and with it the slow, patient work of understanding what exactly settled over the village on the afternoon the rails broke. The gas that burned over Ohio has not finished its work. It is still moving through the groundwater, still clinging to the sediment, still metabolizing in the livers of the community, still being slowly and imperfectly contained by the same industrial logic that produced it, a logic that knows how to prevent an explosion, but does not yet know how to prevent the aftermath from becoming a permanent resident of the places and the bodies that stood in the path of the cloud that should not have been there. The fire was not the end. This is the first thing to understand about what happened in East Palestine after the cloud lifted and the cameras left. The fire was a conversion, not a conclusion. It took one set of chemical threats and exchanged them for another, trading the immediate possibility of a shattering explosion for a quieter, more patient form of disaster. The black column that rose over the town on February 6, 2023, looked like a monument, a singular event that could be marked in time and then remembered. But what settled from that column did not settle as a memory. It settled as a presence, molecular and indifferent, into the soil that fed the gardens, into the sediment at the bottom of Sulphur Run, into the fatty tissues of the fish that never saw the surface before they died. The controlled burn reached temperatures in excess of 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This is not a detail from a firefighting manual. It is a chemical threshold. At that temperature, vinyl chloride does not simply combust into simpler, safer components. The heat rearranges its atomic architecture, providing the energy necessary for chlorine atoms to bind to carbon rings in configurations that nature never intended and that mammalian biology never evolved to interpret. The result is a family of compounds known as dioxins and furans, polychlorinated dibenzodioxins and dibenzofurans, to give them their full bureaucratic names, as if a longer designation might contain their potency. These are not the gases that irritated throats and burned eyes on the night of the fire. They are heavier, more stable, more patient. They do not blow away on the next strong wind. They fall. They adhere. They wait. And waiting, in the context of these molecules, is measured in human generations. The half-life of the most toxic dioxin congener in the human body ranges from 7 to 11 years. This means that a single exposure event does not fade in days or months. It persists. It cycles through the liver and is stored again in adipose tissue, released slowly during weight loss or lactation, recirculated, reabsorbed. A woman exposed on the night of the burn carries the chemical signature in her body long after the National Guard has packed its tents and the railroad company has issued its final statement. If she becomes pregnant, the compound crosses the placental barrier. If she breastfeeds, the compound is present in the milk. The exposure becomes an inheritance, passed forward without consent, written into the first cellular divisions of a life that had no name when the cloud passed overhead. The Environmental Protection Agency arrived in East Palestine within days and began the methodical work of measurement. Their surface water samples, drawn from streams that received runoff from the derailment site, told a story that was true and incomplete. Vinyl chloride levels downstream ranged from non-detectable to 1.5 parts per billion. These are small numbers. A part per billion is a single drop of ink in a swimming pool, a single second in 32 years. The numbers fell, in most cases, below the thresholds that trigger immediate regulatory panic. And yet, the aquatic life told a different story. The Ohio Department of Natural Resources counted roughly 43,000 dead animals in the local waterways in the days after the fire. Fish, amphibians, crayfish, the crawling benthic organisms that form the base of the food chain. These creatures did not die from vinyl chloride alone. They died because the sediment at the bottom of the creek had become a repository for compounds that aquatic respiratory surfaces were never designed to filter. The benthic zone is the dark floor of a stream, the layer where fallen leaves decompose and larval insects feed, and the slow work of nutrient cycling takes place. It is also, in the aftermath of a dioxin release, a chemical archive. Dioxin-like compounds are hydrophobic. They avoid water and cling to organic particles. They sink. They accumulate in the fatty tissues of the worms and insect larvae that live in the sediment. And then the fish eat the larvae, and the larger fish eat the smaller fish. And the concentration increases at each step, a process that toxicologists call biomagnification. A word that sounds abstract, but describes a very physical reality. The poison becomes denser as it climbs the ladder of predation. The eagle that eats the fish gets a dose that the fish itself never experienced in the water. The human who eats the fish gets a dose that began as parts per trillion in a creek bed and ended as a measurable burden in a liver. This is what epidemiologists call slow exposure. It is the opposite of the acute crisis that filled television screens. It does not announce itself with a boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion. It does not arrive with sirens. It accumulates over years, over dietary choices, over the simple act of gardening in soil that received the ash from a plume without anyone realizing that ash had fallen. Cancer clusters linked to dioxin exposure typically take a decade or more to manifest in population data, and by the time the statistical signal rises above background noise, the original event has long since been archived as resolved. The cleanup was completed. The payments were distributed. The town, in the official record, has been made whole. The only problem is that the bodies of the people who live there are running on a different clock than the regulatory agencies. They always have been. They always will be. The residents of East Palestine began reporting symptoms within hours of the burn. Burning eyes, sore throats so persistent that swallowing became a conscious act, nausea that came in waves and receded without warning. And then there was the taste. Again and again, in the testimony collected by community groups and local physicians, the same description appears. A metallic taste, strange and sharp, like breathing pennies. It is a clinical symptom with a clinical name, dysgeusia, but no clinical explanation can capture the experience of waking in your own home, in the town where your grandparents were born, and discovering that the air itself has become unfamiliar, that the simple act of breathing has become a source of doubt. The EPA maintained its position throughout the spring of 2023. Continuous air monitoring showed no levels of volatile organic compounds above short-term health benchmarks. This was a true statement. The monitors were calibrated to detect acute threats, the kind that would send a first responder to the hospital within an hour. They were not designed to measure the presence of compounds at levels that increase cancer risk over a lifetime of exposure. They were not designed to detect the taste of pennies. The gap between what the instruments measured and what the residents experienced became a chasm, and into that chasm fell the credibility of every institution that claimed to be protecting the public. The people of East Palestine could not see parts per billion. They could feel their eyes burning. They could taste the metal on their tongues. They could watch their children develop rashes that no doctor could definitively link to the spill, but that no doctor could definitively explain away. The science of detection had become so sensitive that it could measure the ghost, but the science of medicine had not yet developed the tools to diagnose the haunting until the haunting was already written into the chromosomes. This is the paradox that Chapter 10 must carry. The technology of chemical analysis now operates at a scale that borders on the unimaginable. We can detect a single molecule in a liter of water. We can identify a dioxin congener by the specific pattern of chlorine atoms around a carbon skeleton. We can map the adduct that a vinyl chloride metabolite forms with a guanine base in DNA, pinpointing the exact location where a future mutation may begin. And yet, we cannot tell a mother in East Palestine whether her daughter's persistent cough is a consequence of the burn or a coincidence. We cannot conduct the longitudinal health study that would follow 10,000 people for 20 years and produce an answer, because no federal agency has the authority to order such a study, and no corporation has the incentive to fund it. The measurement is exquisitely precise. The meaning is deliberately vague. The ground remembers what the air forgets. The dioxins that fell on the fields and the gardens and the creek beds do not degrade on a human timescale. They bind to soil particles. They are taken up by the roots of vegetables. They enter the bodies of the chickens that scratch in the yard and the deer that browse at the edge of the forest. They become part of the landscape, not as a visible stain, but as a chemical fact that no amount of topsoil removal can entirely erase. The cleanup crews can excavate the most contaminated zones. They can haul away the railroad ties and the ballast and the visible slicks of butyl acrylate that pooled in the ditches. They cannot excavate the entire watershed. They cannot remove every particle of ash that fell on 1,000 separate properties in the hours when the black cloud drifted northeast on a wind that no one had modeled in advance. And so the residents wait. They wait for test results that take months to process. They wait for health studies that have not been funded. They wait for a diagnosis that may not arrive for 10 years, or 15, or never, because angiosarcoma of the liver is so rare that a single case in a small town could easily be dismissed as chance, as background noise, as the sad but unremarkable mathematics of cellular replication gone wrong. The workers in the Louisville plant in 1974 had the grim advantage of numbers. 4 cases of a 1 in 30 million cancer in a single factory was a statistical scream that could not be ignored. The residents of East Palestine have no such concentration. They are scattered across a landscape of private homes and small farms, each household alone with its own decisions about whether to trust the water, whether to eat the vegetables from the garden, whether to let the children play in the creek that was their favorite place before February 3. The science teacher who filled the glass jar did not do so for a class demonstration. She did it because she understood, at a level that no press conference had addressed, that the question of contamination in East Palestine would not be answered by the immediate round of testing. The white film separating from the water was an emulsion, a suspension of organic compounds that had been dispersed by the spill, and were now slowly coalescing as the current stilled. The jar sat on the lab shelf under a post-it note that read, "Run this next year," not because the equipment was unavailable, not because the procedure was unclear, but because the compounds that matter most in a dioxin release do not reveal themselves in the first round of sampling. They require time to accumulate in tissue, to concentrate in sediment, to cycle through the food web until the signal rises above the detection limit of not just the instruments, but of epidemiology itself. The glass jar is a quiet object. It does not explode. It does not produce a mushroom cloud. It sits on a shelf in a room where students will learn about the periodic table and the water cycle and the chemistry of carbon bonds, and it holds, in its stillness, the entire problem of the plastic age. We have built a civilization on the assumption that dangerous molecules can be contained, trapped inside pipes, locked away in polymer chains, transported safely across a continent in steel cars that will never fail. And when that assumption breaks, when the containment fails and the molecules escape, we discover that containment was never a permanent state. It was a temporary negotiation, a treaty between chemistry and engineering that could be violated at any curve in the rail, at any overheating bearing, at any decision made in a control room by people who had modeled the explosion, but not the ash. The archive of this disaster is not held in a government database. It is held in the sediment of Sulphur Run. It is held in the fatty tissues of the fish that survived the initial kill, but carry the chemical memory in their bodies. It is held in the soil of gardens that were planted before the derailment and will be harvested after the cleanup is declared complete. The ground will remember what the air forgot, not because the ground is sentient or vengeful, but because the half-life of a dioxin molecule is indifferent to human attention spans. 7 to 11 years in the body, decades in the soil. A geological epoch in the sediment at the bottom of a slow-moving creek. And so the jar waits. The teacher will run the sample next year, or the year after, or whenever the funding materializes and the protocols are approved. And when the results come back, they will show something. They will show concentrations measured in parts per trillion, numbers that look harmless on a spreadsheet, but that represent, in the quiet algebra of long-term exposure, a probability, not a certainty, not a guarantee of illness. Just a slight tilting of the odds, a fraction of a percent added to the lifetime cancer risk, distributed across a population of 5,000 people who never consented to the experiment. The numbers will be published in a journal that few residents will ever read. The town will continue. The children will grow. The creek will flow toward the Ohio River, and eventually to the Mississippi, and eventually to the Gulf of Mexico, carrying its dissolved load of molecules that were never supposed to exist outside a polymerization reactor. And the boundary between a safe home and a poisoned one will remain, as it has always been, a matter of where you draw the line on the chromatograph, a matter of who gets to define the threshold between acceptable risk and preventable harm. The fire was not the end. The fire was just the moment when the invisible became briefly visible, when the gas that normally hides inside the plastic infrastructure of daily life rose up in a black column and demanded to be seen. What happened after the fire, the settling, the accumulation, the slow threading of chlorine compounds through food webs and fatty tissues, and the cellular machinery of unsuspecting bodies, that was the real disaster. The disaster that has no end date. The disaster that will still be unfolding when the jar on the lab shelf is opened by a student who was not yet born when the train left the tracks. On the day Norfolk Southern filed its quarterly earnings report for the first 3 months of 2023, the line item for the East Palestine derailment sat nestled between purchased services and depreciation, a quiet entry of $387 million. The number was precise but provisional, like a note written in pencil at the bottom of a ledger page that had already been totaled. The railroad's investor presentation described the charge as covering cleanup, remediation, and community support. In the same report, the company declared $2 billion in shareholder dividends. The arithmetic was not difficult. It simply meant that the cost of a burning cloud over an Ohio town could be absorbed into a single quarter's earnings and still leave room for a profit. The disaster, from the perspective of the financial statement, was a solved problem. But a financial statement is not a town. It does not count the number of households whose drinking water changed taste in February and never fully returned to what memory insisted it had been. It does not record the precise day a family decided to stop opening the windows at night, even when the spring air came in sweet and cool, because the smell after rain now carried a chemical note they could not name but could not ignore. An earnings report has no column for the slow migration of anxiety into the routines of bedtime, laundry, gardening, and the long, appraising look a parent gives a glass of tap water before handing it to a child. The $387 million was real, but it described only the visible portion of a debt much larger and far less measurable. Legal historians, watching the first lawsuits coalesce in the spring of 2023, recognized the choreography. The pattern had emerged in West Virginia after the 2014 Elk River chemical spill, when 4-methylcyclohexane methanol leaked from a Freedom Industries storage tank and invaded the water supply of 300,000 people. It had appeared again in 2015 after a tank collapse sent a plume of the same compound into the drinking water of Charleston. In both cases, the community's demands unfolded in stages. First, immediate relief, bottled water, temporary housing, a hotline for symptoms. Then, a push for medical monitoring. The long and legally fraught effort to establish a health registry that would track cancers, respiratory disease, neurological symptoms in the exposed population for decades. Then, the struggle for property compensation, because a house a quarter-mile from a derailment site does not hold its value the way a house in a suburb without a chemical history does. And at each stage, the same discovery emerged: no federal law required any of it. No statute compelled a railroad to fund a longitudinal health study. No agency had the authority to order years of blood draws, urine panels, and cancer screenings for the 4,700 residents of East Palestine and the surrounding township. The machinery of response was a patchwork of state regulations, voluntary commitments, and the slow, unpredictable leverage of litigation. The Federal Railroad Administration kept its own books, and they were thick. Between 2013 and 2022, over 124,000 rail accidents occurred in the United States. Hazardous materials were released in nearly 10,000 of them, a figure that averages to 2 or 3 a day, somewhere in the country, often in rural areas where the sirens are volunteer and the first responders arrive in their own trucks. The data included everything from a minor leak of a single tank car valve to the full rupture of a pressurized gas carrier. But the reporting system was not designed to track what happened to the people who breathed the air afterward. The FRA could tell you the cause of a derailment, the speed of the train, the condition of the track, the classification of the cargo. It could not tell you how many children in the evacuation zone later developed asthma that their doctors considered unusually persistent. The gap between the accident report and the medical record was vast, and no government body had been given the job of closing it. East Palestine entered that gap. In the months after the burn, the community's demands did not follow a linear path toward resolution. They spiraled. Residents discovered that the water testing data released by the EPA and the State Environmental Agency answered some questions and raised others. A reading of vinyl chloride at 1.2 parts per billion in a creek was, by regulatory standards, below the threshold for acute health concern. But the same reading, multiplied by a lifetime of drinking, cooking, and bathing, entered the actuarial territory of the acceptable cancer risk, one additional case per million people, a statistical ghost that public health agencies had long ago decided was the price of industrial modernity. The language of acceptable risk, so reasonable in a policy document in Washington, sounded different when it was spoken into a microphone at a town hall in a high school gymnasium where the audience was not a population of millions, but a few thousand identifiable faces. The gymnasium became the recurring architecture of the aftermath. In April 2023, the school district opened its doors for a meeting that was part public hearing, part corporate press conference, part collective act of bearing witness. The folding chairs were arranged in rows on the polished floor, the basketball backboards folded up against the ceiling like sleeping wings. At the front, a long table with microphones and water pitchers. Behind the table, representatives from Norfolk Southern, the EPA, the Ohio EPA, and the county health department. In the audience, the citizens of a town that had spent 2 months learning the vocabulary of toxicology, monomer and polymer, parts per million and parts per billion, dioxin congeners, half-lives, vapor pressure, and the strange arithmetic by which a short-term exposure limit is calculated for an 8-hour workday, but not for a lifetime of sleeping above a creek that once ran white with fish kill. One mother stood up with a binder. It was a 3-ring binder, the kind used for school projects, thick with plastic page protectors. Inside were lab results she had commissioned for her own well water, her own soil, her own blood. The pages showed numbers. Some were within the reference ranges printed beside them. Some were not. She did not read the numbers aloud. Instead, she held the binder up, its weight visible in the angle of her wrist, and asked the men at the front table to describe the color of the air on the night of the controlled burn. The question was simple. It was also, in the strictest sense, unanswerable. Vinyl chloride burns with a luminous, green-edged flame, but the smoke from the February 6 vent and burn was black, a mountain of carbon and chlorine and trace organics that blotted out the winter sun. The air, at ground level, had no color. It had a taste, a sting, a film that settled on car windows and porch railings, but no one who had been there could assign it a hue. The company representative leaned toward his microphone and said, "We are committed to transparency." Transparency, in the months that followed, became a word that functioned like a pane of glass. It allowed everyone to see the activity behind it, but it did not open. Norfolk Southern published water sampling data. It funded a preliminary community assistance program of $25 million. It hired contractors to dig out contaminated soil along Sulphur Run, where the derailed cars had spilled butyl acrylate and ethylene glycol monobutyl ether into the stream. The cleanup teams worked in protective suits and respirators, their white Tyvek coveralls glowing against the brown winter mud, while residents 100 yards away drank bottled water and wondered whether the air in their basements, where their children's toys were stored in plastic bins, was slowly concentrating the same volatile compounds that the workers were being paid to avoid. The visible activity was real. The question was whether it was sufficient and whether anyone with authority could require it to be otherwise. A legal scholar at the University of Pittsburgh, who had studied the aftermath of chemical spills for 2 decades, noted that the United States had never developed a comprehensive federal framework for post-disaster health surveillance. Occupational exposures were regulated, and workplace safety laws required medical monitoring for workers in certain industries. But if a hazardous chemical escaped into a community, the exposed population was not a workforce. They were civilians, and the law treated them differently. The EPA could order a responsible party to clean up a site. It could not order a responsible party to fund 20 years of cancer screenings. A county health department could apply for a federal grant to study the local disease registry, but the grant process was slow, competitive, and subject to the vagaries of congressional appropriation. The result was that communities like East Palestine entered a legal and administrative wilderness in which they could demand answers, but no one was legally required to provide them in the form that mattered most: a long, patient, statistically rigorous accounting of what had entered their bodies and what it would do there. The financial architecture of the response reinforced the asymmetry. The $387 million charge that Norfolk Southern recorded was a corporate accounting figure, not a legal penalty. It included the cost of the cleanup, the community fund, and the legal fees already accruing, but it was not a fine. It was not a judgment. It was an expense, tax, deductible in its eligible portions, and it was spread across the quarters in a way that protected the company's credit rating and stock price. The $2 billion in dividends, meanwhile, was a distribution of profit to shareholders, a return on capital that the railroad had earned by moving freight, including hazardous chemicals, across tens of thousands of miles of track. The disparity between what the community received and what the shareholders received was not illegal. It was the ordinary functioning of a system in which the risk of moving vinyl chloride through populated areas was borne by the people who happened to live near the tracks, while the profit from that movement accrued to investors who might never see the tracks at all. This was the paradox that the town hall meetings could not resolve. The nation had spent 80 years building a plastic infrastructure, and the cost of its failure fell on the few thousand people who happened to live at the intersection of a profit margin and a curve in the rail line. The debt was real, but it was not entered into any national ledger. No agency would ever issue a report titled "The Total Cost of the East Palestine Derailment to the Health and Livelihood of its Residents." The CDC might conduct a study years later that found a statistically significant increase in certain cancers among the exposed population. The study would be published in a peer-reviewed journal, and it would note that causation could not be definitively established because the cohort was too small and the latency period too long. The study would then become a footnote in the longer history of vinyl chloride, another entry in the archive that documented what the molecule did to human tissue, but never compelled anyone to prevent the next exposure before it happened. The binder that the mother held in the gymnasium was, in a sense, a private version of that missing national ledger. It was a document of her family's exposure, assembled at her own expense, from labs that would mail results to a residential address without requiring a lawyer's approval. Across East Palestine, similar binders were being assembled in kitchen drawers, in home offices, in the glove compartments of trucks. The town was conducting its own health survey, piece by piece, family by family, in the absence of a federal one. The results were not aggregated, not peer-reviewed, not subject to quality control, but they represented a kind of knowledge that the official monitoring could not produce, the knowledge of what it felt like to live inside a chemical exposure, to taste it in the back of the throat, to see the rashes on a child's skin and wonder whether they were the usual childhood eczema or something with a longer, quieter name. The shape of the settlement, when it eventually comes, will likely follow the Elk River pattern. There will be a class action certified by a federal judge. There will be a compensation fund administered by a claims resolution facility. There will be categories of injury, property loss, business interruption, personal injury, medical monitoring. Each resident will receive a letter, dense with legal language, offering a payment in exchange for a release of future claims. The payments will be calculated according to formulas that take into account proximity to the derailment site, duration of evacuation, and the presence of certain symptoms during the acute phase. The formula will not ask about the color of the air. It will not account for the years of uncertainty, the extra doctor visits, the decision to delay a pregnancy, the quiet sale of a house at a price below its pre-derailment appraisal. The law, like the financial statement, is an instrument of precision, and precision leaves out what it cannot measure. And yet the debt remains. It is not canceled by the signing of a release form. It is not erased by the demolition of a contaminated house or the dredging of a creek bed. It is a debt written into the bodies of the exposed, in the DNA adducts that the liver's enzymes quietly generate from chloroethylene oxide, in the cellular mutations that have half-lives of their own, longer than the memory of the burn, longer than the news cycle, longer than the statute of limitations. The debt will not come due all at once. It will be paid in increments, over decades, in the oncology wards of Ohio hospitals, and the quiet exhaustion of chronic illness. The $387 million on the earnings report was the visible fraction of that debt, the portion that could be converted into a quarterly charge and disclosed to investors. The rest remains invisible, unacknowledged, carried by the few thousand people who happened to be asleep in their beds when the pressure relief valve tripped and the invisible gas began its slow migration into the Ohio night. The last image from the town hall meeting is not the mother with the binder, though she is the one the cameras captured. It is the moment after she sat down, when the company representative leaned back from his microphone and the room fell into a silence that was neither hostile nor satisfied. It was a silence of waiting. The gymnasium lights hummed overhead. The water pitchers on the table held their own small archives of dissolved gases and trace minerals. Outside, in the parking lot, the night air smelled of spring and something else, something that a person who had not been there in February might not notice. But the people in the room had been there, and they would notice it for the rest of their lives. A faint chemical note on the edge of every spring, carrying the memory of a fire that was supposed to make them safe. The river at dawn did not look like a crime scene. The light came across the water in the way it always had, a thin sheet of silver laid over the slow-moving surface, no trace of the orange combustion cloud that had stood above the valley 6 months earlier. A heron worked the shallows near the bank, its movements unhurried, its biology still running on the old rhythms of fish and current. At the river's edge, half buried in mud and gravel, a length of white PVC pipe emerged from the earth and discharged a steady trickle of treated water. The same water that had passed through kitchen sinks and washing machines in the homes uphill, invisible now, indistinguishable from the water it joined. The pipe had been laid decades ago, one of thousands in this watershed, a civil engineering choice made long before anyone in East Palestine, Ohio, had learned to pronounce vinyl chloride monomer, or had checked a well with a new and permanent wariness. That pipe is a document, if you know how to read it. It records a decision made by a previous century, that a gas once too volatile to handle, too carcinogenic to breathe, could be trapped inside a rigid polymer and sent underground to carry drinking water. The decision was audacious, and it worked. For most of its service life, the pipe did not leak, did not corrode, did not require replacement. It was a quiet monument to the chemical engineering that had turned an unstable molecule into the third most produced plastic in the world. By the time the Norfolk Southern 32N derailed on February 3, 2023, global PVC production was already on a trajectory to reach 60 million tons annually by the end of the decade, driven less by American suburbs than by the construction booms of developing economies, where the need for cheap, durable pipe and siding outweighed any lingering unease about the monomer's history. The International Agency for Research on Cancer had long since classified vinyl chloride as a Group 1 carcinogen, its highest category, meaning there was sufficient evidence of carcinogenicity in humans. There was, the agency noted, no known safe exposure limit for that endpoint. The gas did not have a threshold, it only had probabilities, and the probabilities were written into the DNA of workers who had handled it before the closed-loop systems were installed, and into the soil of towns where rail cars had split open, and into the slow accumulating algebra of lifetime risk distributed across every kitchen tap connected to a PVC service line. And yet, the river at dawn looked innocent. That is the trouble with this molecule. It hides in plain sight, locked inside the objects that make modern life hygienic and affordable. The siding on the house, the window frames, the flooring, the medical tubing, the blood bag, the credit card, the shower curtain, all of them solid, stable, the chlorine atoms bound tight in the polymer chain. The danger lives in the moment before the polymerization, when the monomer is a compressed gas traveling by rail through the Ohio Valley, and in the moment after the polymer's useful life ends, when it meets fire and releases its original ghost. Between those two moments stretches the long truce we call infrastructure. A 2021 paper in Environmental Science and Technology added a strange footnote to this story. A team of researchers had discovered that certain soil bacteria operating in anaerobic conditions deep underground could produce vinyl chloride from naturally occurring chlorinated compounds. The molecule was not entirely a human invention. It existed in the dark corners of the carbon cycle, a trace gas exhaled by microbes in wetland sediments and forest floors, far below any concentration that could cause harm. The bacterium, Dihalococoides, could even break vinyl chloride down further, reducing it to ethene, a harmless hydrocarbon. The discovery did not absolve industry. The natural background levels were minuscule, and the anthropogenic production was millions of tons. But it did resituate the story. The poison was not an invader from outer space. It was a naturally occurring chemical potential that had been concentrated and accelerated by human ingenuity, a faint natural whisper amplified by the railroad tank car and the reactor vessel into a roar. This reframes the entire archival question. The gas that burned over Ohio was never a stranger. It was the ghost of every plastic object that surrounded the community, a reminder that the boundary between convenience and catastrophe is a molecular one, maintained by vigilance and luck. The problem was not that vinyl chloride existed, but that we had gathered so much of it into one place, under pressure, on a moving train, in a town where the emergency plan was a binder on a shelf, and the air monitoring equipment was calibrated for short-term occupational exposure. not for the chronic inquiries of a frightened population wondering why their eyes burned and their water tasted like metal. The river at dawn, the pipe, the heron, they are all part of the same system. The pipe is a technology of containment. The river is a technology of dilution. The human body is a technology of metabolic conversion. It's cytochrome P450 enzymes ready to transform the absorbed molecule into an epoxide that can misread the genetic code. All these technologies are operating simultaneously, and none of them are failing in a way that can be photographed. The archive on vinyl chloride does not close. That is the final lesson of the documents. What closes is the attention of the public, the window of media coverage, the funding for longitudinal health studies that require tracking a cohort for 20 years. The cleanup crews will finish their work. The railroad will pay its fines. The town will be declared safe, its air within acceptable limits, its water treated to the current standards. But the molecule has a half-life in human adipose tissue measured in years, and the cancers it causes have a latency measured in decades, and the soil bacteria are still down there, producing their own tiny amounts of the same gas in the anaerobic mud, indifferent to human law. The archive remains open because the chemistry does not recognize closure. It only recognizes equilibrium. Consider the scale of the containment effort. Every PVC pipe buried in the ground is a sealed vessel. Every polymerization reactor is a controlled environment. Every rail car is a pressure vessel with a relief valve designed to release gas rather than burst. The entire industry is an architecture of seals, gaskets, sensors, and protocols. When it works so well that we forget what is inside. We take our showers behind vinyl curtains, drink from plumbing that carries a faint monomeric signature at the parts per trillion level, walk on flooring that off-gases trace volatile organics for the first year after installation, and none of this registers as harm. The risk is diluted to the point of statistical disappearance, a 1 in a million cancer probability that regulatory agencies deem acceptable, because the alternative, replacing the entire plastic infrastructure, is unthinkable in economic terms. The cost of the cure would exceed the cost of the disease, measured in the currency of quarterly earnings and municipal budgets. But the train that derailed in East Palestine did not obey that calculus. It concentrated the risk back into a single point. It turned a distributed lifetime exposure into an acute event, a cloud that smelled like bleach and acid, a burning that produced not just hydrogen chloride and phosgene, but trace dioxins and furans, molecules so toxic that their presence in the environment is measured in parts per quadrillion. The controlled burn was a decision made in the fog of incomplete modeling, a choice between the certainty of a potential explosion that could scatter shrapnel across a mile and the uncertainty of a toxic plume that would drift across the valley and deposit its contents into Sulphur Run, into the soil, into the fur of pets, and the fibers of carpets. The authorities chose the plume. They may have been right. The explosion might have killed directly, while the plume will kill slowly, statistically, in ways that will never be traceable to a single cause. Because the cancers will look like other cancers, and the immune disorders will look like other immune disorders, and the epidemiological signal will be lost in the noise of a population too small to provide definitive answers. So the archive remains open, not in the legal sense. The settlements will be signed, the class actions will be resolved, the money will be distributed, but in the biological sense. The children who played in the creeks after the burn, the families who returned to their homes after the evacuation order was lifted, the workers who cleaned the contaminated soil, They are now part of an experiment that lacks a control group and a monitoring protocol. No federal law requires their long-term health surveillance. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention was invited to conduct a brief assessment, but the assessment was cross-sectional. A snapshot, not the decades-long cohort study that would be needed to detect an excess of angiosarcoma, the liver cancer that Dr. John Creech identified in the Louisville workers in 1974, the cancer so rare it normally occurs in 1 in 30 million people. That cancer was the signal that finally forced the regulatory response, because it was so unusual that a cluster of 4 cases in a single plant could not be dismissed as chance. East Palestine will not produce that kind of signal. Its population is too small, and the exposure was too brief, and the cancers, if they come, will be the common kinds: lung, breast, colon, that have too many contributing causes to be pinned on a single burning cloud. And yet, the river at dawn remains. The water moves downstream. The pipe discharges its treated contents. The heron swallows a fish, and the fish, if it was feeding near a sediment bed where dioxin settled, carries a small additional burden of fat-soluble toxins in its tissue. The burden will not kill the fish. It will not kill the heron. It will simply be there, a chemical fact, a number in a spreadsheet that a graduate student might compile a decade from now for a thesis on environmental persistence. The slow exposure will unfold without a dramatic crisis, without a mushroom cloud, without a congressional hearing. It will be the kind of disaster that never makes the front page, because it is too slow to be news and too distributed to be an event. The PVC industry, for its part, is not a villain. It is a rational actor responding to market demand. The world needs pipes that do not corrode, siding that does not rot, medical devices that can be sterilized. These are genuine goods, and the material delivers them. The chemists who designed the closed-loop systems, the engineers who reduced the residual monomer levels in the finished polymer, the safety officers who monitor the rail transport protocols, they are not indifferent to harm. They have simply made a calculation that the benefit outweighs the risk. And for most of the population, most of the time, that calculation holds. The trouble is that the calculation breaks down at the edges, in the places where the concentration exceeds the design threshold, where the train hits the curve at the wrong speed, where the emergency valve opens and the gas billows into the night, and the people on the ground discover that all the regulatory safeguards are written for a world that does not include them. The bacteria in the soil continue their slow, anaerobic metabolism. They do not know that the molecule they produce has been the subject of litigation, of epidemiological studies, of international agency classifications. They do not know that a town in Ohio has been changed by a different concentration of the same substance. They simply continue the carbon cycle, reducing and oxidizing, creating and destroying, without intention or consequence. In that sense, they are the truest archivists. They record what the human records miss, that the boundary between natural and unnatural is porous, that the chemistry of industry is drawn from the same periodic table as the chemistry of life, and that the difference between a harmless background level and a toxic plume is a matter of scale, not essence. A mother in East Palestine, checking her well water 6 months after the fire, draws a sample and sends it to a private lab. The result comes back non-detect for vinyl chloride. She does not trust the result because she has learned that detection limits are not the same as safety limits, and because she has read about the slow desorption of contaminants from the soil into the groundwater, a process that can take years. She installs a carbon filter anyway. The filter is made of plastic. It was manufactured in a plant that handles vinyl chloride under closed-loop conditions. Its workers monitored for exposure. Its emissions permitted by a state environmental agency. The plastic in the filter is a solid, stable, unlikely to release its monomer at room temperature. It is a technology of containment, bought to contain the perceived failure of another technology of containment. The irony is not lost on her, but she does not have the energy to pursue it. She just wants the water to taste right, to not leave that coppery film on her tongue, to not wake her children coughing in the night. And that, in the end, is what the archive records. Not a moral lesson, not a political indictment, not a solution, but a persistent condition. We live inside the containers we built. The containers are imperfect. The gas is always there, on the other side of the seal, waiting for the temperature spike, the pressure failure, the human error, or the geological time that will eventually degrade the polymer back into its constituent atoms. The miracle of PVC is real, and so is its cost. Both things are true simultaneously, and neither cancels the other. The river at dawn will keep flowing. The pipe will keep discharging. The tests will keep coming back with numbers just below the threshold of concern, and the threshold itself will keep moving because, as the science improves, the sensitivity of detection outruns the pace of regulation, and the gap between what we can measure and what we are required to remediate grows wider each year. In that gap, between the part per trillion and the legal limit, between the medical symptom and the epidemiological proof, between the fire and the cancer diagnosis, the gas that burned over Ohio lives on, not as a cloud, but as a question. The question is not whether it will ever be answered. The question is what we will do while we wait. The archive revealed a gas that never really leaves. Vinyl chloride monomer, the sweet-smelling vapor that escaped a Paris flask in 1835, that pooled in the lungs of Louisville reactor workers, that rose as a black column over East Palestine, cannot be unmade. It can only be contained. And containment is temporary. The pressure relief valve hisses. The tank car derails. The pipe ages. The fire finds the plastic. The molecule returns to its original form, invisible, heavier than air, following drainage ditches into basements and bodies. The evidence we brought up takes specific shapes. A firefighter's jacket in Ville Platte, Louisiana, still carrying the bleach-edged ghost of a 2011 tank car fire years after every wash. A glass jar on a high school lab shelf in Ohio, its water sample slowly separating into a white film labeled "Run this next year." 4 angiosarcoma cases in a single Louisville plant, a cancer so rare that 1 in 30 million was the expected rate, not 4 in one factory. And the heron at the river's edge swallowing a fish that carries a dioxin burden from sediment that will outlast the bird, the creek, perhaps the town. The broader implication is not a moral. It is a condition. Useful things carry hidden costs. The pipe that does not corrode, the blood bag that does not break, the siding that does not burn, all of them required a bargain. The bargain was sealed in the 1970s. Acute occupational death traded for chronic, ambient, statistically invisible exposure. 1 extra cancer per million people. Acceptable risk. The words were written in the Federal Register, not on the kitchen faucet. The mother in Toledo who smelled something sweet in her water never signed the consent form. Neither did the children who played in Sulphur Run after the burn. Some substances are safest when they remain evidence, not experience. The descent was close enough. Now the pressure eases from the hull. The darkness thins above. The black water turns to gray, then to blue. The hatch opens, and cold sea air fills the lungs for the first time in an hour. The vessel surfaces. The archive file closes, but the evidence we brought back stays with us, not to frighten, but to inform. The pipe beneath your sink is still safe most of the time, but the gas inside it remembers how to burn. If this kind of quiet descent into science and history is what you came for, you can subscribe to the Deep Archive. The river at dawn, the heron, the pipe. The question remains,